Hello everyone, welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I moved from Chicago to Albany with the woman I was sure I'd spend the rest of my life with. My fiancée, Maggie, had accepted a new job here, and after a decade of cramped apartment living in the city, the idea of a house, a place to call our own, felt like a dream. The 1920s Dutch colonial we found was charming, nestled on a quiet street in Albany's Pine Hills district. It had character, as the seller kept saying, as he pointed out features like the original crown molding, the clawfoot tub in the bathroom, and the wooden floors that creaked underfoot. But it was something else, the heaviness of the air, that settled over us the second we stepped inside. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. That kind of quiet that wraps around you like a dense fog, making everything feel just off. The first few days were spent unpacking and getting used to the house's peculiarities. It was bigger than we were used to, with wide, high ceilings and long hallways. The house was filled with old charm, but there was something in its bones that made it feel like it was holding its breath, waiting. On our first night, after things were mostly settled, we let Juniper, our golden retriever, explore the house. She was a good dog, friendly, energetic, never shy, but as soon as we reached the top of the stairs, she froze. Her ears went flat, her tail tucked between her legs. She stared at the attic door, a solid wooden thing with chipped paint and a brass knob, like she was seeing something we couldn't. "Is she okay?" Maggie asked, looking down at Juniper, who now refused to move from the staircase. I crouched down to calm her, but Juniper wouldn't budge. "She's just scared of the stairs," I said, but I wasn't sure I believed myself. "Maybe the place is just too big for her," Maggie suggested, but there was something in her voice, uneasy, hesitant, that told me she felt it too. That night, the house seemed to creak and groan, like it was shifting in the dark. I couldn't sleep, and neither could Juniper, who stayed curled up beside me on the bed, her head twitching as though she was watching something unseen. The next day, the unease continued. Maggie and I were unpacking in the upstairs hallway when we both noticed it, a patch near the bathroom that always made our skin prickle, like walking through an invisible spider web. The feeling was subtle but undeniable. Our footsteps seemed muffled in that spot, as if the floorboards were absorbing the sound of our movement. The electronics up there were especially bad. The TV, the laptop, even our phones had a tendency to glitch, with voices on calls warping into garbled whispers. I chalked it up to old wiring or bad connections, but Maggie didn't seem convinced. "I feel like something's watching me," she said one night, looking down the long hallway that stretched toward the attic stairs. I didn't know how to respond. The house had a way of making you feel that way, but it was the humming that really got to me. It started, I think, on the fourth night. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but there was no wind that night. I woke up at exactly 4:09 a.m. to the sound of a woman softly humming a lullaby. The melody was faint but distinct, a tune I didn't recognize. I sat up in bed, listening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I sat there, wide-eyed in the dark, trying to process what had just happened. The silence in the room felt suffocating, pressing in on me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Juniper was sleeping soundly at the foot of the bed, completely unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just slipped through the room like a shadow. The next morning, I didn't mention it to Maggie. I wasn't sure if I wanted to worry her, but that night the humming came again, exactly at 4:09. I lay perfectly still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart pounding in my chest. When I finally dared to sit up, the house fell dead silent once more. The silence that followed was worse than the humming. The absence of sound felt too heavy, like something was waiting just out of reach. It didn't take long for me to realize that I wasn't just imagining it. Every night since we moved in, the humming came at exactly the same time. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the house settling, some old pipes vibrating, or even the wind pushing through the cracks in the windows. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't that simple. Maggie was beginning to feel it too. One evening I found her standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the attic door, her face pale. "I don't like it here," she said, her voice quiet but shaking. "I know," I replied, but I didn't know how to fix it. There was something about the house, the way it seemed to press in on us, that made me wonder if we were ever really going to feel at home. Little did I know, that was just the beginning. The attic had always felt like an afterthought, a forgotten space tucked under the eaves of the old house, accessed only by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. I'd been avoiding it for weeks, not because I was afraid, but because it felt like opening a door to something I wasn't ready to face. It wasn't until Maggie mentioned that we should clear out the attic for storage that I found myself standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the dusty wooden door with a sense of reluctant curiosity. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit space filled with old trunks, faded boxes, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something else. Something sweet and metallic. The air was thick with dust, the kind that made you cough after just a few breaths. The attic was colder than the rest of the house, which was strange because it was summer and we'd had the windows open all day. As I began to sort through the boxes, moving aside old blankets and forgotten keepsakes, I saw it. An antique vanity dresser tucked into the far corner behind a stack of old suitcases. It was beautiful in a way that was almost unsettling, the kind of piece you'd expect to see in a museum, not gathering dust in the attic of a house you'd just moved into. The wood was dark, polished, and carved with intricate rose patterns along the legs and edges. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It was tarnished, the glass slightly cloudy, as if it had been watching for too long. I approached it cautiously, my hand hovering over the drawer handles. When I opened the top drawer, 3 things hit me at once. The scent, a strange mixture of lavender and something metallic like rusted iron. It wasn't the sweet smell of old perfume, it was sharper, more intrusive. The photograph, a faded, yellowed picture of a woman in a wedding dress. Her eyes were scratched out with what looked like a nail, jagged and deliberate. She had an unsettling expression, her lips drawn tight as if she was trying to hold back a scream. And then the urge, the overwhelming, irrational need to slam the drawer shut. It was like the dresser itself was breathing, waiting for me to make a move. I obeyed without thinking, slamming the drawer shut so hard the attic floor vibrated slightly beneath my feet. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed drawer, my heart racing. The room felt different now, heavier, like the air had thickened. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something strange. Scratches on the inside of the mirror's glass. They weren't there before. They looked fresh, as if someone had dragged their fingernails down the surface, leaving behind thin crimson lines. That night, the house felt different. It wasn't just the humming anymore. It was like the house itself had shifted, become aware of my discovery. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph, the woman's eyes, hollow and empty, staring back at me. I kept hearing faint noises from the attic, creaking floorboards, soft thumps, the faintest whisper of fabric dragging against wood. Juniper was on edge too. She wouldn't go near the attic door, even when I tried to coax her with treats. She'd sit at the bottom of the stairs, staring up with a look of pure terror in her eyes, her body rigid and her tail tucked tightly between her legs. Maggie noticed it too. She kept glancing toward the attic door, her face pale and distant. One night she said quietly, "I don't think we're alone here." I wanted to believe she was just imagining things, but I knew deep down that the dresser wasn't just an old piece of furniture. It was something else. Something that had been waiting for us. A few days later, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went back up to the attic, determined to figure out what was going on. The dresser was still there, its tarnished mirror reflecting the dim light from the small bulb overhead. I stared at it, wondering why I felt so drawn to it, like it was calling me. I opened the drawer again, this time slower, more deliberate. The scent of lavender hit me immediately, stronger than before, mixed now with something darker, something metallic and sharp. I reached inside, feeling around until my fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. It was a small folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, my heart pounding. The paper was old, its edges brittle and yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully, revealing a note written in jagged, uneven handwriting. "She's watching. She knows what you did." The words sent a chill down my spine. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Who was she? What had I done? I looked up at the mirror, and that's when I saw it. Faint, but unmistakable. A shadow moving behind me, reflected in the glass. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The attic was empty, just the dresser, the dusty old trunks, and the lingering scent of lavender. But I knew I wasn't alone. The house had always been quiet at night. At least that's what I used to believe. Before the attic, before the dresser. The static began subtly, like a faint hum in the background of everyday life. At first I thought it was just the old wiring, or maybe the city's power grid acting up. But soon it became something more. Something that crept into the spaces where silence should have been. It started with the hallway. The upstairs hallway was narrow, with creaky floorboards that groaned under even the lightest step. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, its floral pattern peeling at the edges. There was a patch near the bathroom where the air felt different, thicker, almost as if walking through a curtain made of invisible threads. I noticed it the first time when I was heading to bed. As I crossed that spot, a shiver ran down my spine and the hairs on my neck stood up. It wasn't cold. It was something else. An invisible pressure pressing against me. My phone flickered briefly, the screen glitching for a split second before returning to normal. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the next morning, when I grabbed my phone to check the time, I saw the same glitch. This time, it was accompanied by static in the speaker, like someone was whispering just beneath the threshold of hearing. I held the phone up, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the faint crackle of interference. The feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing day. I started noticing other things too. The lights flickered, not in the usual way, like when a bulb is about to burn out, but erratically, as if something was tampering with the wiring. But it wasn't just the lights. Our Wi-Fi signal would drop out for no reason, even though the router was working fine. The TV would turn on by itself, showing nothing but static, the screen pulsing like it was breathing. I tried to tell Maggie about it, but she just gave me a tired look. "Old houses do weird things," she'd say, brushing it off like it was nothing. But she wasn't sleeping well either. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling with wide, unblinking eyes. One night, I woke up to find the hallway light on. I'd turned it off before going to bed, and when I got up to check, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway was empty, except for the faint outline of a figure standing just beyond the bathroom door. It wasn't clear, just a shadow against the dim light, but it was there, motionless. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't even breathe. I reached for the light switch, and the moment I flipped it on, the figure vanished. There was nothing there, but the air felt heavier, like something had been waiting just out of sight. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the static persisted. The next day, I noticed something strange. I was sitting in the living room scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like someone murmuring from the other room. I looked up, expecting to see Maggie, but she was in the kitchen humming softly to herself. I followed the sound, heart racing, and it led me to the attic door. The door was slightly ajar, the handle turned just enough to let a sliver of light spill out into the hallway. the same light that had flickered on and off in the middle of the night. I hesitated, hand on the door, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed it open. The attic was dark, but I could see the outline of the dresser, its tarnished mirror reflecting the dim hallway light. The dresser's drawers were slightly ajar, though I'd made sure they were shut the night before. I stepped inside, and the air grew colder. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails scratching against wood. I turned toward the dresser, and there it was. Scratches on the mirror, deeper this time, almost like claw marks. They didn't look like they'd been made by anything natural. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cool glass. The moment I did, the tapping stopped. Silence. But then a voice, a whisper, right behind me. "You shouldn't have opened it." I spun around, but there was no one there. The attic was empty, except for the dresser. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I wanted to leave, to get out of that attic and never come back. But as I reached for the door, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and closing in. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it without thinking. But the tapping didn't stop. It echoed in my mind long after I was safely back in the living room, trying to convince myself that it was just old pipes, just the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in the attic. Something that didn't want us to leave. Sleep had become a battleground. After the events in the attic, the nights grew longer, filled with restless hours and dreams that felt more like memories than nightmares. It was as if the house wasn't content with just haunting me when I was awake. It wanted to invade my mind, too. The dreams started subtly at first. I'd drift off to sleep, exhausted from the unease that had settled in my chest, and then I'd find myself in the attic again. But it wasn't the same attic I'd left behind. It was darker, suffocatingly so, with a faint, musty smell that clung to the air like damp cloth. The dresser stood there, its mirror cracked and smeared with something dark, almost like dried blood. And there was always a woman. She'd be standing near the dresser, her face obscured by shadows, her eyes hollow and empty. Sometimes she'd be humming that same lullaby I'd heard at 4:09 a.m., the tune twisted and distorted, like the notes were trying to escape. Other times she'd just stand there, motionless, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. I'd try to move, to run, but my body felt heavy, like I was wading through water. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. Then came the whispers. "You're not supposed to be here. She doesn't want you to leave." I'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like I'd been running from something. Maggie would be asleep beside me, oblivious to the terror clawing its way through me. I didn't tell her. Not at first. I thought it was just stress, the kind that creeps in when you're living in a house that feels more like a coffin with windows. But the dreams grew worse. One night, I woke up to find Maggie sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling, with wide, glassy eyes. She wasn't asleep. She was in the middle of a dream. Or maybe it was a nightmare. Her lips moved slightly, forming silent words, her hands twitching as if she was trying to reach for something just out of reach. I shook her gently, but she didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. Then she whispered so softly I almost missed it. "The hair. It's in the dresser." I froze. The dresser? I didn't say anything. I just held her until she woke up, her breathing ragged, her face drenched in cold sweat. I had the same dream," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We were both there in the attic, and there was something else, something behind the dresser, something with hair. We didn't sleep that night. The next day, we decided to confront it. We couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Grabbed a flashlight, and Maggie brought her camera, just in case we needed proof, though I wasn't sure anyone would believe us. The attic door was locked when we got there. Maggie fumbled with the key, her hands shaking. When the door finally creaked open, it felt like opening a door to another world, one where the rules of reality didn't apply. The attic was colder than before, the air thick with dust and something else, something metallic. The dresser sat in the corner, its drawers slightly ajar as if inviting us to look inside. Maggie approached it slowly, her flashlight beam shaking in her hand. "I swear if there's anything in there," she started, but I cut her off. "No," I whispered. "We need to see it." She nodded and we both stared at the dresser. The mirror was darker than I remembered, almost like it was reflecting a different time, a different place. Maggie opened the top drawer. Inside, there was nothing. Just old fabric, a few faded ribbons, and a single yellowed photograph of a bride. But this time her eyes weren't scratched out. They were wide open, staring directly at me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like fingernails against glass. We turned to see the mirror. The scratches had appeared, fresh and deep, as if someone had been clawing from the inside. Maggie gasped. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have opened it. We didn't wait to see what else was inside." We grabbed the photograph and slammed the drawer shut, the sound echoing through the attic like a gunshot. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed us down the stairs, seeping into the walls, into the floorboards, into our minds. That night the dreams were different. I wasn't in the attic anymore. I was in the house, but it was empty, just the echo of what used to be. The walls were cracked, the ceiling caved in. The dresser was there, sitting in the middle of the room, its mirror covered in thick, dark grime, and in the darkness I saw her, the woman from my dreams. But this time she wasn't alone. There were others, faces twisted in silent screams, their eyes hollow, their mouths stitched shut. They reached for me, clawing, dragging me toward the dresser. I woke up screaming. Maggie was still asleep, her face peaceful, but I knew she was dreaming the same thing. The next morning we made a decision. We had to leave. But deep down, I knew the dresser wouldn't let us go that easily. We packed our things. In a daze, the weight of the house pressing down on us harder than before. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a warning, every shadow a reminder that we weren't leaving alone. Maggie's hands trembled as she folded clothes, her movements mechanical, like she was on autopilot. I couldn't blame her. The air in the house felt thicker, heavier, as if it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for us to break the silence. But there was no escape. We'd made up our minds. We were leaving. The lease ended at the end of the month, but we couldn't. Wait, the dresser had been more than just furniture. It was a prison, a tether to something we couldn't understand, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. The night before we were supposed to hand over the keys, we couldn't sleep. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the attic door, while I sat against the wall with a bat in hand. We'd planned to leave quietly without looking back, but the house had other plans. At exactly 4:09 a.m., the same time as the humming, I woke up to the faint sound of a lullaby drifting down the hallway. It was soft at first, almost comforting, but then it twisted into something distorted, a melody strangled by fear. Maggie's eyes snapped open. She didn't need to hear it to know what was happening. The dresser's drawer was slightly ajar. "I can't do this," she whispered. Her voice was shaky, but her eyes burned with determination. "We don't have to," I said, standing up and grabbing the bat. "We're not leaving until we're sure it's done." We crept toward the attic door, our footsteps silent against the creaking floor. The hallway was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. The dresser sat at the far end, its tarnished mirror catching the moonlight, casting eerie reflections. As we reached the attic door, the humming grew louder, more frantic. Maggie reached for the knob, but before she could touch it, the door slammed, shut on its own. We froze. Then the scratching began. It was coming from inside the attic. I kicked the door with all my strength, and it burst open with a loud crack. We rushed in, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, and there it was, the dresser. But it wasn't just the dresser anymore. The mirror was shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor like broken promises. The photograph was gone, and standing beside it was the woman. She was no longer just a shadow or a figure in my dreams. She was real. Her lips were stitched with silver thread, her eyes hollow and dark like she'd been waiting for us all along. Maggie gasped. The woman raised a hand, her fingers long and jagged, pointing directly at me. "You're not leaving." I didn't think. I swung the bat with everything I had, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, the room grew colder, the shadows stretching like claws to pull us in. Maggie screamed, trying to drag me back, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the woman's face as she began to melt into the darkness, her form twisting into something unrecognizable. Then, everything went silent. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor. The attic was empty. The dresser was gone. Maggie was beside me, her face tear-streaked, her hands clutching the photograph we'd found. "I think we won," she whispered. But I knew better. We left the house the next morning, handing over the keys without a word. We never looked back. We never found out what happened to the dresser, but sometimes late at night I hear a faint hum, a lullaby that drifts into my dreams. And sometimes I wake up to find strands of dark hair coiled around my wrist. The dresser didn't let us go. It just waited. I was 10 the first and only time I spent the night at Aunt Lorna's hunting cabin deep in the Adirondacks. I'll never forget the smell of pine sap and kerosene that hit me as soon as we walked inside. The place felt like it had been abandoned for decades, even though Aunt Lorna swore she'd just finished fixing up the place. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath my feet, making it sound like something was crawling under them, scraping and dragging its nails along the wood. It wasn't a place that invited comfort. The cabin wasn't much, just one big room with a wood stove, a ragged couch, and an old wooden table where Aunt Lorna would hang the day's catch, mostly trout from the stream down the hill. Outside, a rickety porch led to the forest, thick with ancient pines and shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. It was all so far removed from anything familiar, from the buzz of city life, from the noise of people and machines. Everything was slower here, darker and more still. Aunt Lorna was a strange one, always looking over her shoulder, always on edge. Even though she seemed cheerful enough, there was something about her that felt distant, like she was just going through the motions of being a relative but didn't quite belong to this world anymore. She'd been living up here alone for years after Uncle Gus passed away, doing her best to keep the place running. From what I'd heard from my brother and the other cousins, she wasn't exactly a fun relative to visit. Most people avoided the cabin if they could. My older brother in particular always seemed to make excuses to leave before the sun set, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. He'd go on about how there was something off about the place, how the air felt heavy, but I'd never been one to back down from an adventure. So when Aunt Lorna called and invited me to spend a weekend at her cabin, I was ecstatic. It was going to be just me, her, and the woods. I felt like a big kid, like I was finally getting a taste of the grown-up life my brother was always talking about. We drove up the narrow, winding road through the thick forest, the trees pressing in on both sides like they were trying to close us in. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was starting to sink behind the mountains, casting long, thin shadows across the landscape. Aunt Lorna didn't seem bothered by it, though. She just pulled the truck into the gravel driveway and waved me inside. "Everything's just the way it should be, kiddo," she said, giving me one of her rare smiles. "Nothing to worry about here." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But from the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The cabin was dim, lit only by the light coming through the cracked windows, and the air inside was cool and stale, like it had been trapped in there for years. There were old photos on the walls, black and white ones that looked like they came from another time, faces of people I didn't recognize. The furniture was mismatched, like it had been cobbled together from yard sales and junk shops. Nothing fit. Not the cabin, not the smells, not Aunt Lorna's clipped, almost nervous way of speaking. I explored the place while Aunt Lorna made dinner in the back. The floor creaked under my feet, and the sound of something moving beneath me seemed to follow me everywhere I went. I tried not to think about it. After supper, we sat outside for a bit while the last rays of daylight faded away. Aunt Lorna told stories about the woods around us, how the pines were ancient, older than the country itself. She told me that if I listened carefully, I could hear the forest talk. I thought she was just being fanciful, trying to make the place seem magical, but there was something in her voice that made me feel uneasy. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and I could hear the wind rustling the branches of the trees, but nothing else. No insects, no owls, no sound of the creek running down the hill. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, suffocating and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. "You should head to bed soon," Aunt Lorna said, pulling me out of my thoughts. "Tomorrow, we'll head out to the stream, before the sun gets too high." I nodded, but my heart wasn't in it. There was something about the night, the way the shadows seemed to stretch and move, that made me feel like I wasn't alone. It felt like the forest was watching me, waiting. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll just finish watching the fire." Aunt Lorna gave me a concerned look, but she didn't press me. She got up and headed inside, leaving me alone by the fire. The flames flickered and danced in the dark, casting long, wavy shadows across the porch. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper, like the wind moving through the trees, but somehow closer. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I turned to look at the woods behind me, but the shadows were thick. The night had swallowed up the trees, and all I could see were the flickers of firelight reflecting off the trunks, giving them the appearance of twisted, human-like figures. I felt a chill crawl down my spine, and for the first time that evening, I regretted coming. But then Aunt Lorna came back out, and for a moment the feeling passed. She was carrying a lantern, the glow warm and reassuring in the darkness. "You sure you're okay, kid?" she asked again, peering into my face. I smiled weakly. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded, but the look in her eyes lingered for a second too long, like she knew something I didn't. "All right then," she said softly. "Sleep tight. And remember, the woods are always listening." I didn't know it then, but those words would stick with me, lingering in my mind like a bad dream, waiting for the night to come when I'd truly understand them. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind howling outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting for me in the dark. I'd never be able to sleep the same way again. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember the darkness closing in, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. The cabin was silent, except for the faint crackle of the dying fire in the stove. Aunt Lorna's breathing was steady and slow, rising and falling like the tide. But I couldn't match it. My mind was too busy, tangled in thoughts about the forest, the shadows, and the strange things Aunt Lorna had said. I drifted in and out of sleep, the line between dreams and reality blurring. Then I woke up to the sound of something soft, a faint rustling noise like dry leaves being shuffled across the floor. At first I thought it was just the wind. The old cabin groaned and sighed with every gust, like it was settling into itself after a long day. But this wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too quiet. I opened my eyes, the faint glow from the stove casting long shadows on the walls. The room was still, but the noise was there again, closer this time, like someone was moving around just outside my bedroom door. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, loud enough to drown out the soft creaks and whispers. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it, and then I saw them. A faint, pale glow flickered near the rafters like the last embers of a fire dying out. At first, I thought it was moonlight sneaking through the cracks in the old walls. But it wasn't. The glow shifted, moving in slow, drifting patterns, and then I saw their mouths, Dozens of small, spectral figures floated just above the floorboards, their shapes hazy, like smoke curling upward from a snuffed-out candle. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to look right through me. Their mouths were open in silent screams, no sound coming from them, just a faint, hollow echo that I felt more than heard. I couldn't move. My body was heavy, like it was made of stone. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures didn't seem dangerous, they were just sad. Lost, maybe. Like they were searching for something but didn't know what. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of a night insect. Just silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes your skin feel too tight. I didn't know how long I stared. It could have been seconds or hours. Time didn't make sense anymore. Then I heard it, a faint click like metal against metal. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, the tall one. It stood at the foot of my bed, its shadow jagged and twisted, like it had been carved out of darkness itself. Its silhouette was tall, easily 7 feet, with broad shoulders and long, spindly limbs that seemed too thin to support its size. A tattered oilskin duster hung from its frame, its edges frayed, and torn like it had been through a storm. But what really made my blood run cold was its face, or the lack of one. Where its face should have been, there was only a rusted bear trap, the jaws slightly ajar, glinting faintly in the dim light. The trap's edges were jagged, like teeth, and the way it sat there staring made me feel like it was waiting for something or someone. It didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. And then, without any warning, it turned toward the back door. Something inside me snapped into motion. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was supposed to follow. It was like an invisible thread was pulling me toward it, taut and unyielding. I slipped out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The cabin was freezing now, despite the summer heat outside. The porch boards creaked under my weight as I stepped out into the night. The air was thick with moisture, the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, clinging to my nose. The sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. The only light came from the flickering glow of the lantern Aunt Lorna had left on the porch. The tall one was standing at the cellar doors. They were supposed to be locked. Aunt Lorna had always been strict about that, locking them every fall before the first frost and not unlocking them again until spring. But now, they gaped open. The wooden doors cracked wide, revealing a dark hole that seemed to swallow the light whole. A stench rolled out, rotten pumpkins mixed with clotted blood, sharp and sickening. I didn't want to go any closer, but the pull was stronger than my fear. My feet moved before I could think, leading me toward the cellar. The tall one didn't move. It just stood there, its trap jaws slightly ajar, waiting. I reached the edge of the opening and looked down. I still don't know what I saw. Just darkness, thick and black. And then, a faint glimmer. Something small, something shiny, glinting in the dark. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my ears. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, but clear as day. "Help me." I stumbled backward, my breath ragged and fast. The tall one turned slowly, its trap jaws clicking shut with a metallic snap, and I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran. When I finally made it back to the cabin, Aunt Lorna was still asleep, her breathing even and steady. I couldn't sleep, though. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the bear trap in the dark. And I knew, deep down, I'd never be able to forget what I saw, because the woods were watching, and they'd been waiting. The next morning came quietly, as if the world itself was holding its breath after the events of the night. The sun slipped through the dusty cabin windows, casting thin beams of light over the battered floorboards, but it didn't feel like morning. It felt like a fragile truce, like the night had been too dark to truly end. I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling. The image of the tall one burned into the backs of my eyelids like an afterimage that refused to fade. My heart was still racing, but the terror had settled into something colder, like fear had turned into ice inside me. Aunt Lorna stirred, her breathing deep and even, unaffected by the night's events. She had no idea. None of them did. She made coffee the way she always did, black and strong, and didn't ask if I'd slept. She just handed me a mug with a tight-lipped smile, her eyes shadowed by something I couldn't quite place. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, her voice steady. But there was a crack beneath it, like a thin layer of ice underfoot. I nodded, though it was a lie. I couldn't tell her the truth. She'd probably laugh it off, call me imaginative or worse. Say, I'd been dreaming, but it wasn't a dream, it was real. The bear trap's clicking sound still echoed in my mind, a reminder that some things don't sleep. We spent the day in silence, the kind that's heavier than words. I kept glancing toward the cellar doors, now shut tight as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. That night I didn't sleep again. Instead, I sat by the window, the only light coming from the dim glow of the stove. I stared out at the dark woods, my mind racing with questions. What was the tall one? What was in the cellar? And why did it feel like I was supposed to be there? The answer didn't come in the way I hoped. Around midnight, I heard it again. A faint sound, like soft footsteps moving across the floorboards beneath me. Not the creaks of the old cabin settling, not the wind. Something else. Something deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I wasn't alone. I grabbed a giant flashlight and crept out of my room, the cold air of the cabin seeping into my skin. The beam of light flickered as I moved, casting long shadows that danced along the walls like they were alive. I reached the hallway, heart pounding. The footsteps had moved to the living room. I could see the faint outline of the cellar door. Its latch still intact, but the door wasn't closed all the way. It was slightly ajar. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I edged closer, shining the flashlight into the darkness beyond the door. And then I saw it. A faint, pale figure standing at the bottom of the cellar stairs. It wasn't the tall one. This was different. It was smaller, child-sized, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. Its mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came out, just that same hollow echo I'd heard before. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The figure didn't move. It just stared. Then, without warning, it vanished. The air grew colder, and the flashlight flickered, its beam dimming. I could hear something faint, like whispers, coming from the cellar. Not words, just sounds, like voices trapped under glass. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to run, but as I did, I felt it, a cold hand brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Nothing was there. But the whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was calling me, begging me to listen. I stumbled backward into the living room, my mind screaming at me to get out. But my legs didn't obey. They carried me forward, drawn toward the cellar door, toward the darkness. I don't know how long. I stood there staring into the blackness, then I heard it, the faint sound of a bear trap snapping shut. I bolted. I ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I pressed my back against the door, listening, but the house was silent again. When morning came, the door was still locked, the cellar door shut tight. But I knew the truth. The house was haunted not by ghosts, but by something older, something darker. And it wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was inside the cabin. Waiting. The morning light seeped through the thin cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, casting slanting rays across the floor. It was the kind of light that made everything feel fragile, like the world was barely holding together after the night I'd survived. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed door, my heart still racing from the events of the night before. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt heavier than the noise. My mind was a tangle of thoughts. Fear, confusion, and an undeniable sense that something was still watching me. Aunt Lorna moved around the small kitchen, humming softly as if nothing had happened. I watched her, wondering how she could be so calm. Did she know? Did she feel it too? When I finally gathered the courage to speak, my voice came out quieter than I expected. Aunt Lorna, did you hear anything last night? She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Hear what, sweetheart? I hesitated. How do you explain the sound of a bear trap snapping shut, the whispers from the darkness, the feeling of cold fingers brushing your neck? Never mind, I muttered, shaking my head. She didn't press me. Maybe she'd heard it all before, or maybe she just didn't want to know. We spent the day packing up. She said we'd head back to town the next morning. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get out, to put miles between me and that cabin. But the thing about fear is, it's not always about the place. Sometimes it follows you. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. But the quiet was never empty. I could still hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, like echoes bouncing off the walls of my mind. Then I heard it again. A faint tapping sound, soft, deliberate, coming from the window. I sat up, heart pounding. The tapping continued, rhythmic and steady. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept to the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was no one there. But the tapping continued, as if someone, or something, was inside the wall, tapping, from the other side. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it wasn't tapping anymore. It was scratching, like fingernails dragged across glass. I backed away, my heart racing, but then I heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It was coming from the wall. I don't remember how I got out of the room, but I found myself in the living room staring at the fireplace. The old iron stove was cold, but the ashes inside glowed faintly, like embers that refused to die. I knelt down, trying to make sense of everything. Then I saw it, a faint smeared handprint on the stone hearth. Not from the outside, from the inside. I knew then that the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by something else, something older, something that had been waiting. The next morning, Aunt Lorna and I left without a word. She didn't ask why I was so quiet, and I didn't offer an explanation. Years passed, but I never forgot. I moved away, started a new life, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I hear that faint tapping, and I wonder if it's still waiting for me. Years had passed since that night at Aunt Lorna's cabin. I'd moved on. College, jobs, relationships. But there were things you can't outrun, not really. The nightmares returned every so often, flickering like old film reels in my mind. The tapping, the whispers, the shadow with the bear trap for a face. I tried to convince myself it was just trauma, a product of an overactive imagination. But deep down I knew better. It was the letter that brought me back. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday, the envelope old and yellowed with age, the handwriting scrawled in a shaky, familiar script. It was from Aunt Lorna. I know you'll never believe this, but I need your help. The cabin is still there, and it's still waiting. I didn't hesitate. I packed a bag and drove back to Cold Hollow, the road twisting through dense woods just like I remembered. The landscape hadn't changed much. Same crooked trees, same overgrown path leading to the abandoned cabin. But something felt wrong. The cabin stood in eerie silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The door creaked open, with a reluctant groan when I pushed it. Inside, the dust was thick, the air heavy with the scent of decay. It was like time hadn't touched it at all. Aunt Lorna was there, sitting by the fireplace, her face pale and hollow. She looked older than I remembered, her eyes haunted. I shouldn't have come back, she whispered, not looking at me. But I had to. I sat down across from her, my heart pounding. What's going on, Aunt Lorna? She took a shaky breath. It's not just a place, it's a thing. The Gristle Man. It's not just a legend. It's real, and it's hungry. I listened as she told me everything. She'd been trying to ignore it all these years, hoping the memories would fade, but the whispers never stopped. They'd grown louder, more demanding. She'd been seeing things, shadows moving where there should be none, voices calling her name from the darkness. And then she showed me the journal. It was old, leather-bound, with pages yellowed by time. Inside were sketches, rough drawings, of the figure I'd seen that night, the one with the bear trap for a face. The entries were filled with notes about missing people in the area, descriptions of strange occurrences, and references to the Gristle Man of Cold Hollow. "It's not just the cabin," Aunt Lorna whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the land. The roots of this place run deep, deeper than we ever understood. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run. But something kept me there." That's when the tapping started, soft at first, just like before, then louder. A steady, rhythmic noise coming from the cellar. Aunt Lorna's face turned ashen. "It's open." We both knew the door had been locked for decades. We crept toward the cellar, the air growing colder with every step. The door creaked open, revealing the dark abyss below. The smell hit me first, rotting, metallic, something worse than just decay. We descended slowly, the flashlight's beam flickering as if it was afraid to illuminate the truth. And there it was, the Gristle Man. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real. A grotesque, hunched figure with twisted limbs, its face a rusted bear trap, jagged and stained with dark, congealed blood. Its hollow, eyeless gaze locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of pure, primal fear crash over me. Aunt Lorna screamed. The creature moved fast, faster than anything should have, and grabbed her. I froze, paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch, as it dragged her into the darkness. Then silence. I don't remember how I got out of the cellar, how I managed to drive back to town. All I know is that I left the cabin behind, burning in my rearview mirror. I never spoke of it again. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed in the dark, I hear it. The faint clack of a bear trap snapping shut. And I wonder if the Gristle Man is still waiting. The apartment at 47 Bleecker Street wasn't supposed to be a good deal. But sometimes desperation trumps logic. I found the listing online late one night, scrolling through pages of overpriced shoeboxes that smelled like mildew and regret. But this one, $450 a month for a one-bedroom in Hollow's End, Pennsylvania. The photos showed cracked linoleum, faded wallpaper, and a view of a brick wall that looked like it had been there since the dawn of time. Perfect. I emailed the landlord, expecting a generic "sorry, it's gone" reply. Instead, I got an immediate response from Mr. Grayson, the leasing agent. His email was oddly formal for someone renting out an apartment that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. "Available immediately," he wrote. "Come by tomorrow. Don't be late." There was no mention of the building's history, the strange noises, or the fact that the last tenant had mysteriously disappeared. Just a straightforward offer. I met Mr. Grayson the next afternoon. He was thin, too thin, with sharp cheekbones that made his smile seem more like a grimace. His eyes were pale like washed-out sky, and he didn't shake my hand, just handed me the keys with a casual flick of his wrist. "You'll love it here," he said, his voice smooth but hollow, like he'd practiced that line 100 times. I didn't question it. I was desperate. The apartment itself was everything I'd expected, and then some. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit space. The ceiling was low, the walls plastered with faded floral wallpaper that peeled at the edges like it was trying to escape. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a sound that seemed to echo louder than it should have. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't just mildew, it was something else, something metallic, like old pennies mixed with stale air. I tried to shake it off, convinced it was just the age of the building. The kitchen had a chipped countertop, the sink faucet dripped steadily, and the bathroom was so small I had to step into the tub just to close the door. But the bedroom, That's where things started to feel wrong. The bed was old and creaky, the mattress sagging in the middle like it had given up on being comfortable. But what caught my attention was the vent near the floor. It was covered in dust, but as I knelt down to check it, I heard something faint. A soft, rhythmic sound. Whispers. Not words, just murmurs, like the building itself was sighing. I stood, up quickly, brushing it off as nothing. After all, old buildings creak and groan. That's normal. But even as I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the noises began. At first it was subtle, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall behind me. I convinced myself it was just the pipe settling. But then the scratching grew louder, 5 quick, frantic scrapes. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the walls. I reached for my phone, flashlight on, and pressed it against the wall. Nothing, just old plaster and dust. But then I saw it. A small, yellowed tooth embedded in the insulation, its edges sharp and brittle. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. What the hell was that doing there? I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just some weird old relic left behind by the previous tenant. Maybe it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was watching me, and the more I stayed, the more it felt like it was settling in around me. I signed the lease without asking any questions. That was the first mistake. I didn't expect much on my first night in the apartment. Just me, my duffel bag, and a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey to wash down the lingering unease. The tooth had been weird, sure, but I told myself it was probably just some kid's lost baby tooth from decades ago. Maybe the building had been a daycare center back in the 50s. I wasn't even drunk when I first heard it. The scratching started again, 5 quick, frantic scrapes. Exactly the same as before. Only this time, it wasn't just from the wall. It came from the ceiling. I sat up in bed, heart racing, the room bathed in the flickering orange glow from the street lamp outside. The sounds grew louder, almost rhythmic now, like a heartbeat. Grabbed the flashlight from my bedside table and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the ceiling. Nothing. Just old paint and cracks. But then, I saw it, a faint shadow shifting just beyond the light's reach. It was too dark to make out any shape, but it moved. I held my breath, listening. The scratching stopped, and then I heard something else. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Get out." I froze. It was barely audible, but it was there. I wasn't crazy. I swung the flashlight around the room. Nothing. Just the same old apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards. But the air felt different, like it was heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was just old pipes expanding or the building settling. Maybe even the wind. I was overthinking it as usual. But I couldn't ignore the fact that when I woke up, the tooth was gone. I swore I'd left it on the floor beside the wall, but when I checked, it wasn't there. I searched the entire apartment. Nothing. Maybe I imagined it. I told myself that, too. That night, I didn't sleep with the lights off. I kept the flashlight on my nightstand. The beam pointed at the wall where I'd found the tooth. The scratching started again. Only this time, it wasn't from the wall. It was under the bed. Grabbed the flashlight, my hand trembling, and pointed it toward the floor. At first, I saw nothing. But then a shadow moved. It wasn't a shadow cast by the flashlight. It was something else, something darker. And then I saw it. A hand. Thin, bony fingers clutching the edge of the bed, nails digging into the floor like they were trying to pull something or someone out. I froze, and then the hand started to move. Toward me. I screamed. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment that night. I remember running, the door slamming behind me. and the sound of something scraping against the floor as I fled down the hallway. The next day, I went back. Because that's what you do, right? You don't just abandon an apartment like that. I expected to find everything as I'd left it, but the room was different. The bed was made, the toothbrush I'd left in the bathroom was gone, and the tooth, it was back. Sitting on the nightstand, perfectly placed like it had never left. I didn't tell anyone, because who would believe me? But I knew one thing for certain. The apartment was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the tooth on the nightstand like it was a ticking time bomb. The faint, metallic scent of rust lingered in the air, mingling with the stale mustiness of the old apartment. I kept thinking, why is it here? Why me? The walls whispered. I don't mean whispered, like someone's talking softly. I mean the walls themselves made noises. Low, grating murmurs that I could feel in my chest, not just here. At first I thought it was the pipes. Old buildings do that. But this was different. It wasn't mechanical. It was alive. Leave. Now, thus, I'm not proud of it, but I almost left that night. Almost. But something held me there, curiosity, fear, maybe even a sense of responsibility. I'd signed a lease. I was stuck until the lease ended. The next day, I found myself walking through the apartment like it was a crime scene. I checked the windows. Locked. The doors. Secure. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the air felt wrong. Dense, like I was breathing through wet cloth. I went to the bathroom. The mirror was foggy, even though I hadn't turned on the shower. When I wiped it clean, I saw something strange. A message written in condensation. It's still watching. I stared at it, heart pounding. I didn't write that. I looked around, expecting someone to pop out, but no one did. Just me in the apartment. That night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just in the walls anymore. They were in the floorboards, the ceiling, the very air. Stay. I couldn't tell if they were trying to lure me in or warn me away. I tried to sleep, but my eyes snapped open at the faintest sound. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to find someone there, but no one was, just the empty room. I thought maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress was getting to me, until I saw the scratches, deep red gouges on my arm, thin like paper cuts but bleeding like fresh wounds. I didn't remember getting them. The next day, I went to the building's super, Mr. Grady. He was an old man with a hunched back and a voice like gravel. I'm having some issues in my apartment, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked at me with tired, dark eyes and nodded slowly. Yeah, I've heard stories about that place, he muttered, not meeting my gaze. Stories? I asked, my stomach knotting. He shrugged. Not much happens unless you're looking. Some people say it's cursed, others say it's just old. Cursed? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer, just gave me a tight, knowing look and walked away. I wasn't sure if that was reassuring or worse. That night, I couldn't even make it to the bed. I sat in the corner, my knife gripped tightly in my hand, staring at the door. The whispers were deafening now. Don't leave. Don't leave. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp raps. I froze. I didn't want to answer. But something compelled me. I stood up, knife in hand, and crept toward the door. I placed my ear against it. Silence. Then, you can't leave. I flung the door open. No one was there. Just the empty hallway. But the floorboards creaked behind. I turned around. The shadows were moving, not cast by any light. They slithered along the walls, forming shapes, faces, hands, figures. They weren't just shadows. They were memories. I realized then that the apartment wasn't just haunted. It was hungry, and it wasn't done with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows had grown bold, stretching farther into my apartment, their edges sharp like claws scraping against the edges of my reality. I sat in the corner with the knife clenched in my hand, feeling like the walls themselves were watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. The whispers had turned into voices, not human voices, at least not entirely. They were distorted, layered, with echoes of things that shouldn't exist. Stay with us. You're one of us now. I didn't know if they were trying to comfort me or drag me into something darker. Either way, I wasn't listening. I thought about leaving. Packing up, finding another place, dropping the keys in the mailbox and walking away without looking back. But the lease was a cage. Mr. Grady's words echoed in my head. Some people say it's cursed. Others say it's just old. Old. Sure. Like old bones waiting to be dug up. The next day, I decided I needed answers. I went to the library, an old, creaking building that smelled like mildew and forgotten stories. I dug through archives, old newspapers, and property records until I found something. Emily Voss had lived in 47 Bleecker Street, apartment 3B. She vanished without a trace, her neighbors saying she'd been different, sensitive, quiet, always talking to herself. The search lasted for weeks. They found nothing. No body, no clues. Just an empty apartment with a locked door and a faded "for rent" sign. But the kicker? I stared at the grainy photo of Emily, her face framed by dark hair, eyes bright but distant. Something about her felt familiar, like I'd seen her in my dreams or in the reflections in my bathroom mirror. That night, the apartment felt colder. The air was thick and the whispers were louder, like a crowd pressing in from all sides. I didn't even bother to turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor, back against the wall, knife ready, waiting. And then it happened. The door creaked open, slowly, like something trying to sneak in. I didn't move. A shadow slipped in, tall and thin, its shape distorted by the flickering light from the hallway. It was standing there, just watching. I could see its outline clearly now. Jagged edges like burned paper and a face that wasn't a face. Just a hollow space where something should have been. "You know me," it whispered. I didn't recognize the voice. It was, "Too old, too wrong. You're one of us now," it repeated. I lunged with the knife, but it passed right through the shadow. It laughed, or at least that's what it sounded like. A sound like metal scraping against metal. I backed away, heart pounding. "You can't leave," it hissed. And then it reached out, not with hands, just the shadow itself, stretching, growing, reaching for me. I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I screamed, kicking at the darkness, but it held fast, dragging me toward the edge of the room. I grabbed the knife with both hands and stabbed blindly. The blade sank into something solid, flesh maybe. The shadow screamed, a high-pitched wail that shook the walls, and then it vanished. I was left sitting, on the floor, shaking, the knife trembling in my hand. The next day I found the apartment door locked from the inside. I swear I didn't lock it. I tried to leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and ran down the hall. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled on the handle, kicked it, screamed, but it was like the door was part of the building, fused into the walls. The whispers were back, louder this time. "You're not leaving." I looked back at the apartment. The door cracked slightly open, and I saw her, Emily Voss. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth stitched shut with dark thread. She reached out, her fingers long and twisted. I realized then, she wasn't just missing, she was part of the apartment now, and soon I would be too. I don't know how long I've been here. The walls are closing in, the whispers never stop. I've stopped trying to fight. I'm writing this now because I think someone might find it. Maybe before it's too late. I'm still me, I think. But I can feel the shadow pulling at me, piece by piece. And soon, I'll be nothing more than a memory etched into these walls. If you're reading this, run. Don't come looking for me. The apartment won't let you leave either. I don't remember when the days stopped feeling different from the nights. The apartment has swallowed time, leaving me with only fragments, flickering lights, shadows that stretch longer than they should, whispers that rise and fall like waves against my sanity. I can't tell if I'm awake or asleep. Maybe I've been both. Maybe I've been neither. I woke up with the sense that something had changed. The apartment felt quieter, not the usual oppressive, suffocating quiet. This was a silence so deep it pressed against my eardrums like water waiting to drown me. I sat up, the knife still gripped tightly in my hand, though it felt lighter now, almost like it was trying to slip away, like it wasn't meant to be part of this reality anymore. The room looked different. The walls were darker, their texture rougher, as if the paint had peeled away to reveal something beneath. Something old and rotten. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and rust, and then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. Not from the walls this time, but from inside my own head. Tap, tap, tap. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound grew louder, like something trying to break through from the other side. Then I realized there was someone knocking, but not at the door, at my mind. I stood up, heart racing, and followed the sound. It led me to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged over, but the fog didn't clear when I wiped it. Instead, the reflection remained hazy, like the glass was holding something back. I leaned in closer. That's when I saw her, Emily Voss. But she wasn't just in the mirror. She was in the glass itself, her face twisted into a silent scream, her hands pressing against the other side, trying to reach me. "Help me." Her lips moved, but there was no sound. I tried to touch her, but the glass was solid. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat, and then the glass cracked. Not with a sound, but with a sudden, oppressive pressure that I felt in my chest. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The cracks spiderwebbed across the mirror, and through them I saw what was behind the glass. It wasn't just Emily, it was them all. Faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams, eyes hollow and dark. They were trapped. Inside the apartment, their souls anchored to this place like nails hammered into wood. And I was next. I ran. I don't remember where I went. The hallways stretched on forever, the walls closing in, the whispers turning into screams. I could feel hands reaching out, tugging at my clothes, my hair, my skin. But I didn't stop. I finally burst out of the apartment door and into the hallway, only to find myself standing right back where I started. The door to 47 Bleecker Street was right there, the number glowing faintly in the dim light. "You can't leave," the voice echoed, and I knew it was true. Because when I turned to look back at the apartment, the door was open, and Emily was standing in the doorway. She wasn't trapped anymore. She was free. I don't know how much time has passed since then. I'm writing this now, scribbling in the margins of an old notebook I found tucked beneath the floorboards. The apartment doesn't let me leave. It doesn't need to, because now I'm part of it. A voice in the whispers, a shadow in the corners, a name forgotten by time. But maybe, just maybe, someone will find this and maybe they'll understand. If you're reading this, don't come looking for me, don't try to save me. Because the apartment doesn't just keep you inside, it becomes you, and when it's done, you won't even remember who you were. Daniel and I had always dreamed of living in a historic building. There was something about the idea of inhabiting a space with history, a place with stories to tell. When we saw the Whitmore Lofts, we thought we'd found the perfect spot. The building stood proudly in Black Grove, Vermont, a small town tucked away in the quiet mountains. It was one of those places where the air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the winters were long, cold, and heavy with snow. The building itself had once been a textile mill, and after the factory closed in the 1920s, it had been converted into apartments. The exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and antique fixtures made the lofts feel charming and full of character. The leasing agent, Kara, a woman in her 40s with an unsettlingly enthusiastic smile, told us that apartment 3B was one of the quieter units. "It's as quiet as a church," she promised. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional hum of the radiator. Daniel and I were drawn to the space immediately. The high ceilings, the tall windows, the vintage light fixtures, it felt like we were stepping back in time. The apartment had a welcoming, lived-in feel to it, yet it wasn't cluttered by the memories of its previous tenants. Kara said we were lucky to snag 3B. It was one of the last available units in the building, and it was move-in ready. All we had to do was sign the lease, hand over the first month's rent, and we'd be settled in. So on a bitterly cold December afternoon, we unloaded our boxes into the apartment, our boots crunching on the snow-covered sidewalk. I remember looking around, already envisioning where our furniture would go, where our couch would sit, how the bookshelves would line the walls, and where we'd hang the art that had been sitting in storage for months. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, cleaning, and settling in. Daniel, always the meticulous one, made sure everything was in order. I worked from home, setting up my office in the corner of the study. The apartment was peaceful, almost too peaceful. It wasn't long before the feeling of stillness turned into something more, something I couldn't put my finger on. That evening, I set to work on my laptop, reviewing some contracts for my job. I glanced at the clock, 7:30 p.m. Daniel had gone down to the basement to do laundry. He'd been gone for a while, so I called his phone, figuring he'd gotten caught up in the task. When he answered, his voice was thick with confusion. "I never left the living room," he said. My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? You're in the basement. I heard you go down there." "I've been sitting here the whole time. I don't know. I didn't go anywhere." I felt a strange chill sweep over me. This wasn't like Daniel. He was a practical guy, skeptical of anything that could be considered even remotely supernatural. The idea that he would be confused about something as simple as doing laundry seemed off. I went downstairs to check on him. The laundry room was empty. The light was off. There was no sign that anyone had been there. No sign of the laundry baskets Daniel had taken down only half an hour earlier. I called his phone again, and this time he picked up right away. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice shaking a little. He sounded bewildered. "I'm in the living room. I swear I've been here this whole time." I hurried back upstairs, finding him in the living room exactly where he said he was. His eyes were wide with confusion. "What's going on? This doesn't make sense," he muttered. The unease in my stomach deepened. I couldn't explain it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something off about the apartment. It wasn't just the oddness of Daniel's confusion. It was the way the air seemed to hang heavier in the rooms, like the walls were quietly watching us, waiting. We laughed off the incident at first. A glitch in the matrix, maybe. A simple mix-up. But as the days wore on, the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. It grew stronger. A few nights later, something happened that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the apartment. I was taking a shower when I noticed it. A dark, hunched figure in the frosted glass of the shower door. At first I thought it was the steam playing tricks on my eyes, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught in my throat. I ripped the curtain open, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I looked, there was nothing. The tiles were bone dry, no steam, no figure. Shaking, I stepped out of the shower and wrapped myself in a towel. I felt dizzy, like I was coming down with something. When I glanced at the bathroom mirror, I saw my own reflection staring back at me. But I could have sworn I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was no one. The whole apartment felt different after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the next morning when Daniel mentioned the figure, the same one I'd seen. He had woken up at dawn to find a shadow kneeling beside his side of the bed, staring at him. When he turned his head to look, it was gone. That's when we realized someone, was already living in apartment 3B. The days following Daniel's encounter with the shadow were marked by an uneasy silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but rather suffocating, like the walls themselves are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. It was the kind of silence that settles in right before a storm. Daniel and I tried to brush it off as stress-induced paranoia. Moving into a new place, adjusting to a different routine, it was a lot after all. But deep down, we both knew that something was wrong. It was a typical Tuesday evening, the kind where the cold from outside seeps in through the thin old windows, making the apartment feel colder than it should be. I was in my study, typing away, on my laptop, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel had gone down to the basement to do laundry, something he'd always been meticulous about, double-checking the settings, sorting clothes by color, making sure the dryer lint trap was clear. I didn't think much of it at first. The rhythmic sound of the washing machine running downstairs became background noise as I focused on my work. But after an hour, no dryer sounds, no footsteps, just silence. I called out, "Daniel, you good?" No response. My heart started to race. I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, my fingers trembling slightly. His voice answered on the first ring. "I'm in the living room," he said, sounding confused, his tone flat and distant. I froze. "What? You just went downstairs like an hour ago." "I never left the living room," he replied, his voice laced with uncertainty. I felt a cold dread seep into my chest. I didn't know how to explain it, but something was off. "Stay there. I'm coming up." I bolted downstairs, every step feeling heavier than the last. The basement door was slightly ajar, the dim light from the overhead bulb flickering faintly. I called his name again, my voice echoing through the empty space. No answer. The laundry room was empty. The washer and dryer stood still, untouched. There were no clothes in the machine, no sign that anyone had been down there. Just an eerie, suffocating stillness. I rushed back upstairs, my heart pounding like a drum against my ribs. Daniel was still in the living room, exactly where he said he'd been. His face looked pale, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. "Where were you?" I asked, breathless. He shook his head. "I don't know. I was here. I swear I didn't move." I felt the room shift, like the air itself had grown heavier. My phone buzzed with a notification, a message from Daniel. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from his number, sent just moments ago. "I'm in the basement. Where are you?" I froze. Daniel was sitting right in front of me. He hadn't sent that message. I showed him the screen. His eyes widened, and for the first time, fear flashed across his face. What the hell is going on? The next few days blurred together, filled with sleepless nights and unanswered questions. We didn't sleep in the apartment that first night after the incident. We packed a bag and stayed with a friend, unable to shake the feeling that the apartment wasn't safe anymore, but we couldn't run from it forever. When we returned, the apartment felt different, colder somehow. Like it had been waiting for us. That's when it happened again. I was alone in the apartment, trying to sort through the chaos in my mind. The study was quiet, the faint hum of the city outside my window the only sound. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted when I saw it. A shadow, hunched, motionless, standing just beyond the frosted glass of the bathroom door. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then it moved. Slowly, deliberately. My breath hitched as I stood up and walked toward the bathroom. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Nothing. The bathroom was empty. The tiles were dry, the mirror clear. But the air felt different, thicker, colder. I glanced back at the study. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd left it closed. I told myself it was just fatigue. Maybe I was seeing things, but as the days went on, the apparitions grew more frequent. Daniel saw the same figure, but he never said anything until I mentioned it. He'd been waking up in the middle of the night to find it kneeling beside his side of the bed, its shadowy form eerily still, as if it was waiting for something or someone. One night, I finally confronted it. I stood in the doorway, staring at the figure as it knelt in the corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to speak. "Who are you?" I whispered. The figure didn't move, but then, faintly, I heard a voice. Not a whisper, not a murmur, but a soft, broken voice singing. The melody drifted through the room like a ghost, fragile and haunting. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was Eleanor Voss. The apartment felt different after we acknowledged Eleanor's presence. Not in a comforting way, like we'd somehow made peace with the fact that we weren't alone, but in a way that made the air feel thinner, like it was strained under the weight of something unseen. We didn't talk much about the shadow anymore. Not because we weren't scared, but because the words felt like they'd invite more of it. It was a Tuesday again. An ordinary Tuesday, as far as Tuesdays go. The sky outside was gray, the kind of gray that presses down on you, making the walls feel a little closer. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the TV humming softly in the background as I read a book. Daniel was out running errands, grabbing groceries, I think. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. And then it happened. A cold breath. I felt it first, like a wet, icy tendril curling around the nape of my neck, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I froze. My heart thumped hard against my ribcage, loud enough that I thought maybe the walls could hear it too. I turned around. Nothing. Just the empty living room, dimly lit by the afternoon light seeping through the dusty blinds. The air smelled faintly of something rotten, like old meat left out in the sun too long. My stomach twisted and I gagged slightly. I stood up, my legs shaky, and moved toward the source of the chill, but there was nothing there. I checked the windows. Closed. No drafts. I checked the bathroom. Nothing unusual. The mirror was clear, the faucet off. But the smell lingered, for hours. Even after I cleaned every surface, aired out the apartment, and lit every candle we owned, the stench remained. A faint, acrid odor that clung to the corners of the room, just out of reach. That night, as I was trying to fall asleep, the faint sound drifted in again. St. James Infirmary blues. It wasn't loud, just a soft warble, like someone humming, from another room. But it was unmistakable. Daniel was snoring softly beside me, oblivious. I sat up, the blanket falling from my shoulders, and strained to listen. The voice was clearer now, growing louder, like it was right next to me. I reached for my phone, intending to record it, but as soon as I turned on the screen, the song stopped. Silence filled the room. I stared at the phone, waiting. Nothing. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound from the bathroom. I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I crept down the hall, the scratching growing louder with each step. When I pushed the bathroom door open, I found the mirror fogged up, but it wasn't me. There was no reflection. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. The fog swirled slightly, forming shapes that looked almost like a face, faint and distorted, but definitely not mine. I backed away, my heart racing. The air grew colder, the smell of rotting meat stronger. I could feel something behind me. Spun around. Nothing. But the bathroom door slammed shut on its own. The next morning, I told Daniel everything, expecting him to dismiss it as another nightmare. But he didn't. "I've been hearing things too," he admitted quietly. "Not just the singing, it's voices, whispers. I thought I was losing my mind. We both knew we weren't. That afternoon, as we sat in the living room, we heard it, the sound of the front door deadbolt engaging itself with a loud click. Daniel got up to check, but the door was locked from the inside. No one was there. We called a locksmith, but the lock was fine. No malfunction, just locked. When we finally got out, we noticed the bathroom door was ajar, but we'd left it closed. The fogged mirror was still there, the strange face faintly visible in the condensation. We didn't sleep that night. The following day, We found something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Wet footprints leading from the bathroom to our bed. We didn't own a dog. There were no other explanations. Daniel's sleepwalking had become more frequent. He'd wake up in the bathroom standing perfectly still, staring into the mirror like he was waiting for something, or someone, to appear. And then there was the record player. We didn't own one, but it wouldn't stay unplugged. It would start spinning on its own, the needle dropping onto the record, playing St. James Infirmary blues in that same cracked soprano voice. We tried to ignore it. We tried to pretend it was just a coincidence. But deep down, we both knew better. Eleanor wasn't leaving, she was getting comfortable. The apartment felt heavier now, like it had absorbed all the fear, grief, and whispers that had ever passed through its walls. It wasn't just the cold drafts or the inexplicable noises, it was the way the space itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Daniel and I had stopped talking about it not because we weren't scared, but because we were afraid that naming the thing would make it real. But it was real. We couldn't ignore it anymore. It was a Thursday, a day that started like any other. Daniel was at work, and I was in the kitchen, making coffee and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had become a background hum in my life. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels too thick, like it's waiting for a noise to fill it. But nothing came. I was just about to call Daniel when the front door deadbolt clicked. I froze. I looked over at the door, half expecting to see Daniel standing there with his usual lopsided grin, ready to tell me he forgot his keys, but no one was there. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic flared in my chest. I checked the lock. Still secure. No way to open it from the inside. The door was locked. From the inside. I grabbed my phone to call Daniel, but there was no signal. The apartment had never felt so suffocating. I walked around trying to find another exit, fire escape, balcony door, but every door was locked tight. The windows were secured, the screens intact. I was trapped. Daniel didn't answer his phone. I tried again. Nothing. It was strange because he usually answered on the first ring, but I figured maybe he was busy. Then, from the living room, I heard a soft thump, followed by the faint sound of a voice humming. It was the song, St. James Infirmary Blues. I rushed toward the sound, my heart pounding. The record player was on, spinning with no record in sight. The needle scraped across the empty grooves, producing that haunting, broken melody. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The mirror was fogged up again, but this time it was different. The fog formed clearer shapes. Letters, written in slow, deliberate strokes. "Get out." I stumbled back, my breath quick and shallow. That's when I heard Daniel's voice. "Hey, I'm home." I turned toward the front door, relieved. But Daniel wasn't there. The voice had come from the bedroom. I crept into the bedroom, the air colder than before. Daniel was standing by the window, staring out at nothing, his face blank. But his reflection was smiling. Not just smiling, grinning. It was twisted, wrong. His reflection was moving independently, its eyes glowing faintly red. I blinked. He was normal again, but I knew what I saw. I ran to him, shaking his shoulders. "Daniel! It's me!" His eyes snapped to mine, confused. I didn't hear you. Come in." But his voice was off, like it didn't belong to him. I didn't know if it was the fear or the adrenaline, but I pushed him away and sprinted toward the front door. It was still locked. The deadbolt wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, screamed for help, but no one answered. Then, from the bathroom, the sound of water running. I hesitated, my heart racing, then slowly walked toward the bathroom, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. I pushed it open. The bathtub was full of water, but it was empty. No sign of anyone, just water, and the faint, blurry outline of someone standing in the reflection of the mirror. I spun around. No one was there, but the water was still running. That night, after hours of trying to unlock the door with every tool we could find, Daniel and I finally managed to force it open. But when we stepped outside, We found something that made our blood run cold. Wet footprints, leading from the bathroom to the front door. They were too small to be Daniel's, too big to be mine, and they were still wet. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we sat on the living room floor staring at the front door, waiting for it to lock us in again. But it didn't. Not that night. The next day, we found an old newspaper clipping tucked inside the bathroom cabinet. It was about Eleanor Voss. It said she drowned in the clawfoot tub on November 3rd, 1932. The cause was ruled accidental. But there was something else in the article. Something chilling. The address of the apartment was listed. The Whitmore Lofts, 1925. We weren't just living in her apartment. We were living in her death, and she wasn't ready to leave. When Jake and I moved into the Crestwood house, we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. It wasn't the kind of place you'd typically see in a real estate listing. The house had a history, and it showed. The floors creaked like they hadn't been polished in decades, and the lights flickered as though they were on their last legs. The whole place had this old, haunted vibe that was hard to ignore, but we weren't worried. Honestly, we were more excited about the low rent and the fact that it was on the outskirts of town, away from the noise, traffic, and all the drama of city life. Jake and I had been friends for years, since college, and moving in together was supposed to be the next chapter of our lives. It was our chance to escape the chaos of our 20s and finally settle into something that resembled adulthood. We'd had our fair share of fun, and now we just wanted to live in peace. Crestwood House was supposed to be the place where we could unwind after a long work day, where we could grab a beer, play video games, and enjoy the silence. At first, everything was fine. A little creaky here and there, but nothing we couldn't handle. In fact, we kind of liked the charm of it all. We'd joke about the strange noises, call it Gary the Ghost, and laugh it off. We even got used to the flickering lights in the kitchen, which, after a few weeks, became almost comforting. It felt like we were in some sort of horror movie, except, without the horror part. We were two guys in our late 20s, too practical to believe in ghosts and too skeptical to let it bother us. We moved in during late summer, and that first month passed in a blur of unpacking, decorating, and setting up our routines. On some nights, we'd stay up late talking about everything and nothing, listening to the house settle as the wind would whistle through the gaps in the windows. Every now and then, we'd hear what we thought were footsteps above us. Slow, dragging steps like someone walking with heavy boots, but we dismissed it as just the house's foundation settling. It was an old house after all, but there were moments when the atmosphere felt different, subtle at first. You might call it an uneasy energy, but we were quick to shrug it off. One morning, I found a picture frame knocked off the wall, lying, face down on the floor. The glass was cracked, but the photo was perfectly intact. "Must have fallen during the night," I said, picking it up and setting it back in place. Jake was a little more superstitious than I was. When I found the light bulb in the bathroom flickering at odd intervals, he looked at me with a nervous laugh. "Gary must be up to something again," he said. But the longer we lived there, the more I began to notice things that didn't feel right. Little things I couldn't explain. One morning, Jake swore he heard music coming from the living room, but when he checked, no one was there, and the stereo was off. The next time it happened, I was in the room with him. We looked at each other, both unsettled. Neither of us had turned it on, and it was too early for anyone else to be in the house. We were starting to question our own senses. But we didn't talk about it much, didn't want to admit that we were getting a little freaked out. It was easier to pretend it was nothing, to chalk it all up to electrical problems or the old house settling. After all, there was no reason to believe in ghosts, right? Then one night, Jake called me into the living room. "You won't believe what happened," he said, his voice a little shaky. He had been sitting in the armchair listening to his vinyl records when the turntable started, spinning on its own. He swore up and down that he'd turned it off and unplugged it, but there it was, the arm moving back and forth as if someone were playing it, the faint crackle of music filling the air. I laughed it off at first, but the look on Jake's face told me he wasn't joking. "It's just a freak accident," I said, trying to ease the tension. Maybe the wiring's bad or the turntable's got a mind of its own, but deep down I could feel something was off. Still, we let it go, thinking it was nothing but a glitch in the system. But then things got stranger. A week later, I was standing in the hallway when I heard something. A noise, faint but distinct, a voice soft and low like a whisper. I turned, expecting to see Jake, but he was in the kitchen. The whispering continued for a moment as if it were coming from inside the walls. I shook it off, but by the time we'd been in the house for a month, something in the air had changed. The noises weren't just random anymore, they were deliberate. Every night after midnight, the footsteps started. Heavy, dragging steps that would echo down the hall. We'd go to check, but every time we found nothing. The silence that followed was thick, like the house was waiting for us to turn away so it could resume its midnight march. At first we chalked it up to our imagination, but when the noises didn't stop, when they became a routine, we stopped pretending it wasn't happening. The truth was, we were both scared. Scared of the house. Scared of the unseen forces that seemed to linger just out of sight. But we didn't know what to do about it, so we kept going through the motions, pretending everything was normal, hoping it would eventually stop. Little did we know, it had only just begun. By the time October rolled around, the Crestwood house had transformed from a quirky old home into something else entirely. It wasn't just the creaky floors or the flickering lights anymore. Those things had become part of the background noise of our lives, like the hum of an old appliance you stopped noticing after a while. No, this was different. This was intentional. The house was watching us. Jake and I stopped talking about it. There was an unspoken rule now. Don't bring it up. It was easier that way. If we ignored it, maybe it would go away. But it didn't. One night, I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. Soft, rhythmic thumping like someone tapping their fingers against the wall. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes again. Or maybe the wind shifting something in the attic. But the sound didn't come from above. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, straining to hear. The tapping stopped. Then, a faint whisper. "You're not alone." I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlight outside the window. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see the dark outline of the hallway. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Jake was just messing with me. But when I called out his name, there was no response. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept toward the door. The hallway was empty, as quiet as the grave. But the door to the bathroom was open, just a crack, as if someone had left it slightly ajar on purpose. I had closed that door before I went to bed. I stepped out cautiously, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The hallway stretched out, dim and oppressive. My heart was racing now, each beat echoing in my chest like a drum. As I reached the bathroom, I noticed something strange. Water on the floor, but the faucet was off. A thin trail of it led toward the closet door. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open. Nothing. Just an empty closet. But then I heard it. A faint, dry, rasping sound like fingernails scratching against something hard. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the dark corners of the hallway. Nothing. But the sound was still there. Now louder, closer. Ran back to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I pressed my back against the door, listening. The sound stopped, and then a soft whisper right next to my ear. "You're not safe." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, Jake noticed the dark circles under my eyes. When I told him about it, he just nodded solemnly, like he'd been expecting me to say something. "I heard her last night," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was in my room." I froze. "What?" Jake rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the memory. "I woke up to someone, breathing right next to me. I turned on the light, but there was no one there. I didn't know what to say. We had both been experiencing things, but now it felt like we were both being targeted. That night, we decided to stay up together. Armed with flashlights and an old camera we found in the attic, we set out to document whatever was haunting us. The house was eerily quiet at first. We sat in the living room, lights dimmed, the camera rolling on the coffee table. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. The darkness was suffocating. We heard it again, the faint thump, thump, thump of footsteps in the hallway. But this time, they weren't. Just moving around. They were approaching. Jake grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the hallway, but it was like the darkness swallowed the beam whole. The light flickered, then died. We were plunged into darkness. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, clammy hand, fingers gnarled and thin as twigs. I screamed, and Jake shouted in response, his voice sharp and panicked. The footsteps stopped. We were too scared to move. Then a voice. A soft, ragged whisper. Leave. The flashlight flickered back on, illuminating the hallway just as the door at the end of the corridor slammed shut. Jake and I stared at each other, our faces pale, our hearts racing. We didn't need to say anything. We both knew. This wasn't just a haunted house. Something was inside. The next day, we decided to investigate. We went into the attic, searching for clues. Among the dusty boxes and old furniture, we found an old journal tucked behind a stack of yellowed newspapers. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but we could make out some words. She walks the halls at night, but she never sleeps. That's when it hit me. She. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold touches. It was her. The woman in the walls. But who was she? And why was she here? The answers weren't in the journal. They were in the walls. And they were waiting. The next few days blurred into a haze of unease. Jake and I avoided the house as much as possible, spending our time at local cafes and libraries, pretending we were just ordinary college students with normal lives. But the house wasn't done with us. We couldn't escape it. After finding the journal in the attic, we couldn't stop thinking about it. The scribbled words haunted us, like a whispered chant we couldn't unhear. We decided to dig deeper. Jake's idea was simple: research. We scoured old newspapers, town records, and even reached out to the local historical society. Our goal was clear: find out who she was. Hours turned into days. We found nothing until we stumbled upon an old article from 1923. It detailed the tragic death of a woman named Sarah Whitaker, who had lived in Crestwood House before it was converted into apartments. The article mentioned strange occurrences reported by neighbors, though they were brushed off as hysteria. Sarah had died in the house, but the article didn't mention how. We pressed further, digging into public records. A report from the county archives caught our attention, an incident involving a suspicious hanging in the bathroom. The name on the report? Sarah Whitaker, the bathroom. The same room where we found the name scratched into the wall. That evening, after piecing together what we could, we decided to return. There was no other choice. We had to face whatever was in that house. As we stepped inside, the familiar scent of old wood and dust greeted us, but something was different. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against our chests. Jake and I made our way to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, the same way it had been that night when I heard the scratching sound. Jake hesitated, then pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, or so we thought. We found something chilling on the mirror, condensation in the shape of a message. I see you. We didn't need to ask who it was from. We knew. But what scared me more than the message was the fact that Jake's reflection wasn't there. I turned to him in shock. "Jake, look." He stared, his face pale as the blood drained from it. His reflection was missing, and then out of the corner of my eye I saw it, a shadow, not cast by any light but moving. It was dark and thin, slithering along the edge of the wall like it had a mind of its own. "Jake," "We need to go." But before I could finish, the shadow moved fast. Too fast. It lunged toward Jake. Jake screamed, but the sound was muffled. I turned to see him gripping his throat, gasping for air as if invisible hands were tightening around his neck. I didn't think. I grabbed the nearest object, a rusty pipe from the broken cabinet, and swung it blindly. The shadow shrieked, a sound that wasn't human, more like a mix of screams and whispers, and Jake collapsed to the floor. I rushed to him, checking for a pulse. His heart was racing, but he was breathing. But that wasn't what terrified me. It was the face in the mirror. I glanced up and saw her, Sarah Whitaker's face staring back at me, twisted and distorted, her eyes hollow and dark, tears streaming from her cheeks like black ink. She was right there, in the mirror, but she wasn't in the room. I yanked Jake out of the bathroom, pulling him toward the door. As we stumbled into the hallway, the lights flickered. The walls groaned as if they were alive, shifting and breathing. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. The next morning, we couldn't sleep. The images from the night before replayed in my mind like a nightmare on loop. I had to know more about Sarah Whitaker. I found an old newspaper article that hadn't shown up in our first search. It was dated from the 1920s, detailing the events leading up to her death. Sarah was a young woman who had been living in Crestwood House with her husband, but he had been abusive, and neighbors reported hearing screaming late at night. One night, the police were called after a loud commotion was heard, but by the time they arrived, Sarah was gone. Her body was found days later. She had hung herself in the very bathroom we had been in. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. The report said her husband was never charged. Instead, the police ruled it as a tragic accident. But what if it wasn't? Jake and I realized then that she wasn't just a ghost. She was a victim, and she wasn't ready to move on. That night, we decided to confront her. We went back to the house, armed with the knowledge that she wasn't just some random spirit. She was trapped, angry, and hurt. We sat in the living room, lights dimmed, and we spoke to her. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling. "We know what happened. We're here to listen." The house grew cold. The lights flickered, and then the whispers started, soft but growing louder. "Leave. Leave me alone." But this time, it wasn't just whispers. It was a voice. Her voice. I saw her then, standing in the doorway, her face hollow, eyes filled with rage and sorrow. I didn't know what to do. But Jake whispered, "We're here to help." And for the first time, Sarah didn't scream. She just disappeared. The house felt lighter, the air clearer, but we knew it wasn't over. Not really, because she was still in the walls, and we'd left the door open. The morning after our encounter with Sarah felt different. Not peaceful, but quieter. The oppressive weight that had hung over Crestwood House seemed to have lessened, like the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for nearly a century. But I knew better than to believe it was truly over. Jake and I didn't sleep that night. We sat in the dim glow of my old desk lamp, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching longer with every passing hour. We talked, tried to convince ourselves that Sarah's absence meant we'd solved the mystery. But deep down, we both knew the truth. She wasn't gone. Not completely. The following days were strange. The house felt different, but not in the way we'd hoped. The air was thinner, almost like it was filled with static. The faint sounds of footsteps would echo when no one was there. Doors would creak open just slightly, only to snap shut when we looked. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I saw it. A shadow flicker across the bathroom door. It wasn't the same as before. This wasn't an entity. It was more like a memory trying to find its way back. I called out, "Jake?" Silence. I opened the door. Nothing. But then I heard it. A faint, distorted whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." We couldn't ignore it anymore. The house was no longer just haunted. It was alive. It fed on fear, on unresolved pain. Jake suggested we get help, someone who knew how to deal with this. So we found an old local medium named Evelyn. She was a small woman, her sharp eyes hidden behind thick glasses, and she'd lived in Crestwood for most of her life. She'd heard the stories, but she'd never been to the house. When we took her inside, she didn't seem frightened. Instead, she walked slowly, as if she was expecting something to happen. She stopped in front of the bathroom door and closed her eyes, placing her hand on the wood. "There's a darkness here," she whispered. "It's not just her." She walked through the house, her fingers brushing against the walls as if reading them. She paused at the spot where we'd found the name scratched into the wall, Sarah Emily Rose, and then her face went pale. "This house, it's full of them." Evelyn told us things we didn't know. Sarah wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only one who had died here. The house had been a place of suffering long before it became a home. The walls had absorbed the pain, the echoes of people who'd been forgotten. There were other names, others who'd died in that house, their stories buried under layers of drywall and paint. Sarah had been the most vocal because she hadn't been able to let go. But she wasn't alone. Evelyn brought out her tools, candles, a bowl of water, and a small bundle of sage. She began to chant softly, her voice weaving through the tension in the room. The temperature dropped, the lights flickered, and then a voice, sharp and angry, filled the room. "You can't save her. She's ours now." Evelyn didn't flinch. She kept chanting, her hands moving with purpose. Jake and I stood frozen, unable to look away. The shadows in the corners twisted and reached for us, trying to drag us back into the darkness. But Evelyn's voice grew louder, more determined. "You have no power here. This house belongs to the living, not the dead." The shadows recoiled, and for a brief moment the house felt still. Then, with a final deafening crack, the lights went out. When they came back on, Evelyn was gone. Jake and I stared at each other, panic flooding our veins, but it wasn't over. The next morning we found something new. On the bathroom mirror, written in foggy condensation, "I'm still here." The words were clear, and they were waiting. The house hadn't let go of Sarah, and it never would. The morning after Evelyn vanished felt like the house itself had been drained of all color, leaving everything washed out and gray. Jake and I sat in the living room, staring at the fogged-up mirror with those chilling words. "I'm still here." We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The silence was louder than any scream. We knew we had to leave. But it wasn't as simple as packing a bag and walking out the door. The house had claimed us in ways we didn't fully understand. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of light, felt like it was reaching for us. We called the landlord, told him we were breaking the lease. He didn't ask questions, just a gruff, dismissive response. Maybe he'd heard the stories before. Maybe he didn't care. But something strange happened when we tried to leave. The front door wouldn't open. We pulled, yanked, kicked. It was as if the door was part of the wall itself, sealed shut by an invisible force. "Jake," I whispered, panic clawing at my chest. "We're not leaving." The lights flickered violently, and the temperature dropped. Our breath came out in visible puffs as the house seemed to come alive. Doors slammed shut on their own. Objects flew across the room. Books, mugs, even a chair. Jake grabbed a flashlight. "We have to get out," he shouted. But the house didn't want us to leave. It wanted to keep us. We ran for the back door, hoping for an escape route, but it was the same, locked tight, as if the house itself had grown new walls overnight. Then we heard it. A faint, hollow whisper echoing down the hallway. "You can't leave." It was Sarah's voice. We turned to see her standing at the end of the hallway, her figure distorted, blurry like a bad signal on an old TV. Her eyes were hollow, and black tendrils of shadow crept from her mouth, dripping down like ink. "You're part of me now." Jake grabbed a chair and threw it at her. The chair passed right through her, shattering against the wall. "We're not yours," Jake yelled. I picked up the book that had been thrown earlier, The Shining, and held it like a weapon. It felt ridiculous, but in that moment it was all I had. "We're leaving," I shouted, my voice shaking. Sarah's form wavered, her shadow flickering like candlelight. But then something strange happened. She smiled. A hollow, twisted smile. "You can't leave without me." Jake's flashlight flickered, then died. We were plunged into darkness. I could hear Sarah's breathing, raspy, uneven, closer than I wanted. But then I remembered Evelyn's words. The house belongs to the living, not the dead. I grabbed the sage bundle from the floor, still half burnt from the night before. I threw it at Sarah with all my strength. The sage ignited with an angry hiss, and for the first time, Sarah screamed. The shadows recoiled, shrieking like they were in pain. "I won't let you go," Sarah wailed, but her voice was fading, getting weaker. Jake joined in, grabbing a broken piece of the chair and shouting, "We're not yours." Together, we forced her back, and with one final burst of courage, we pushed her into the darkness. She vanished with a final echoing scream. The door burst open on its own. We ran, we didn't look back. We left Crestwood House that day, never returning, but sometimes late at night I swear I still hear it. The faint sound of footsteps, distant whispers calling my name. "You can't leave without me." The house didn't just haunt us, it marked us, and now no matter where I go, a part of Crestwood House is always with me. The farmhouse was everything we'd dreamed of. Rustic, spacious, with a porch that wrapped around the front like it was trying to hold us there. When we brought Lily home from the hospital, the place felt like it belonged to us, as if the creaking floorboards and drafty windows were just part of its charm. The midwife had pressed the bundle of dried sage into Lily's swaddle, her eyes dark and distant. "New souls shine brightest in the dark," she whispered, her fingers trembling slightly as she tucked the bundle securely. "The hungry ones can't look away." We chuckled it off, dismissing her words as the ramblings of an old woman who'd seen too many babies and not enough peace. That night, the farmhouse seemed quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, filling the space where the sounds of life used to be. I was the first to wake. The air was heavy, thick with something that didn't belong, something sweet and sour, like spoiled fruit left to rot in the summer heat. The clock read 3:33 a.m. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard it, a faint, wet slurping sound. I bolted out of bed, my breath sharp and fast, as if I'd been running without realizing it. The nursery door was slightly ajar, the faint glow from the hallway light spilling into the room like a warning. I crept toward the cradle, and there it was, an unmistakable sight etched into my memory forever. The rocking chair was moving, creaking back and forth with no breeze to push it. It wasn't the rhythmic sway of a chair rocked by a person. It was erratic, violent, as though something else was trying to escape. Then I saw the sticky residue smeared on the crib bars. It was dark, almost black, with a texture that sent bile rising in my throat. It smelled like spoiled milk mixed with grave dirt, an odor that clung to the back of my nose and refused to let go. I reached for Lily, who was still asleep, oblivious to the horror unfolding around her, and that's when I noticed the tiny bare footprints on the floor, wet, as if someone had been standing there, staring, waiting. The next morning I told my husband, Mark, about it. He laughed it off, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You're just overtired. It's an old house. It creaks, it groans. Maybe the wind got in." But I knew better. We decided to strip the nursery's peeling wallpaper, hoping to freshen things up, though part of me thought it was to expose whatever was hiding behind the layers. That's when the scratching started. The day after we stripped the nursery's wallpaper, the house felt different. It wasn't just the smell of old plaster dust lingering in the air. It was heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The first night after the wallpaper came down, the scratching began. It wasn't loud at first, just faint, like fingernails against metal, thin, sharp, persistent. Mark and I lay in bed, the faint glow of the nightlight casting long shadows across the room. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the scratching grew louder. It was no longer delicate. It was aggressive, like something trying to claw its way out. Mark groaned, shifting in his sleep. I sat up, heart racing. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He didn't answer. I nudged him harder. His face was tense, his eyes barely open. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice low and strained. I didn't know, but I was about to find out. I crept out of bed, my feet silent against the old wooden floor. The scratching was coming from behind the wall in the nursery. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, my breath shallow. It wasn't just scratching anymore, it sounded like whispers. Muffled voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words were jumbled, overlapping, as if the wall itself was trying to talk to me. I backed away, heart pounding, my mind racing for logic. "It's old pipes," I told myself. "It's just the house settling." But I knew better. The next day, I called a contractor to check the walls. I needed answers. The man was named Tom, a gruff middle-aged guy with a perpetually tired look. He didn't seem fazed by the old house, as if he'd seen worse. "You've got some old wiring in here," he said, tapping on the wall with a metal tool. "Could be rats, maybe even some bad insulation settling. Nothing to worry about." But he didn't seem convinced either. When he left, I stood in the nursery staring at the wall. That's when I noticed the faint scratches, tiny, jagged lines etched into the plaster. They weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like letters. I traced them with my finger, feeling the coolness of the plaster beneath my touch. The scratches spelled out a single word: leave. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the nursery door open, the nightlight flickering weakly. At around 3 a.m., Lily began to cry. It was a sharp, piercing wail that echoed through the empty house. I rushed to her room, but when I got there, she was standing in her crib, staring at the corner of the room where the shadows seemed darker than the rest. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear. She pointed with a tiny finger, her voice trembling as she whispered, "She's there." I froze. The corner was empty, but the air felt wrong, cold, heavy, as if something unseen was pressing against me. I picked Lily up, trying to soothe her, but she kept squirming, crying harder. That's when I saw it. Faint, shadowy figures just at the edge of the room, barely, noticeable, flickering like static in the dark. I didn't sleep again that night. It was a Saturday morning when my brother's son, Charlie, left the porcelain doll in the root cellar. I'd never liked that cellar. The wooden stairs creaked with every step, and the air always smelled faintly of mold and something metallic, like rusted nails and old blood. Charlie was 7, the kind of kid who had no filter and an endless curiosity. He'd been exploring the house all morning, poking into drawers, peeking under furniture, and generally making a mess. That's when he found the doll. It was tucked away in a dusty corner of the cellar, its paint chipped, one eye cracked, and a faint smear of dirt across its cheek. Its dress was faded, stitched with threads that had frayed over the years. "I found this," Charlie called, holding it up like a trophy. I forced a smile. "Looks old," I said, taking it from him. "Probably best to leave it down here, but," Charlie insisted, "it's pretty. I think it's lonely. I should have thrown it out then and there. I should have burned it." That night, Lily wouldn't stop crying. It wasn't the usual whimpering or fussiness. This was different. Her screams were raw, desperate, like she was terrified of something just beyond the edge of her vision. Mark and I rushed into her room, but she was wide-eyed, her tiny fists flailing at the air as if fighting off invisible forces. The doll was sitting on the crib's edge, staring at her with that empty, cracked gaze. Neither Mark nor I had put it there. We grabbed the doll, and I swear I felt something, like static, electricity buzzing under my fingertips. I smashed it against the floor with a hammer, but the porcelain didn't shatter. Instead, it bled. Thick, dark, syrupy blackness oozed from the cracks, pooling around the doll like spilled ink. The smell was putrid, rotting apples mixed with something metallic. Mark gagged. I backed away, clutching Lily to my chest. The hauntings grew quieter after that. The scratching stopped, the whispers faded, but something had shifted in the house. The air felt heavier, like the darkness had been stirred, awakened. Then, one night, Lily's crib was empty. I woke up to the sound of faint giggling. I rushed into her room, heart pounding, and found her standing in the corner, staring at nothing, her little arms outstretched as if reaching for someone invisible. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and then I saw it. Shadow, darker than the rest, moving just beyond the crib. It wasn't like a person. It was more like a smear against the darkness, flickering like a glitch in reality. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Lily and ran downstairs, heart racing. Mark was already awake, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "She's here," he whispered, his voice shaking. The next morning I found Lily's favorite stuffed lamb in the hayloft. Its fleece was matted with something dark and sticky, something that smelled like iron and old hay. I tried to tell myself it was just an accident, just a weird coincidence, but deep down I knew Samuel was still here, and he wasn't done yet. The morning after finding Lily's stuffed lamb in the hayloft, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The house felt different, thicker, like the walls were pressing in, suffocating. Mark and I sat at the kitchen table, the morning sun casting long shadows across the worn wood floor. Lily was in her crib, quietly staring at the ceiling, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her blanket as if it was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. "We need to know what's going on," Mark said quietly, his voice tight, with a fear I'd never heard before. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. We'd been living with shadows, whispers, and fleeting glimpses of things we couldn't explain. But now, it was personal. It was our daughter. I remembered the old man who'd sold us the house. His name was Harold, a frail, reclusive figure with a whiskey tremor in his hand and an air of someone who'd seen too much. We'd met him only once during the closing process, when he'd been strangely insistent that we watch out for the corners. Old houses, he'd said, they remember. It was time to find out why. I found Harold sitting on his porch, a bottle of cheap whiskey sweating in his hand. His eyes were glassy, but when he saw me, they sharpened, as if some part of his mind had been waiting for this moment. "I know why you're here," he said before I could speak, his voice gravelly. "You found the doll." I nodded, feeling a cold chill creep down my spine. Harold took a shaky breath and stared at the ground. "Samuel, he was my nephew. Died in that house, right there in that very room." He pointed towards the old barn, its frame sagging under years of rot and neglect. "What happened?" I asked. Harold's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He choked on a peach pit. His father..." His voice broke. "His father couldn't handle the guilt. He left." I swallowed hard. "Why didn't anyone tell us this?" "Because it's not just a story, it's a warning." Harold's voice grew quieter. "Samuel didn't just die in that house, he stayed." He stood up unsteady and stumbled toward the barn. "You need to see for yourself." Mark and I followed, our footsteps crunching against the gravel. The barn door creaked open with a groan, revealing darkness thick enough to feel like it was alive. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mold and something else. Something metallic, like rusted nails and old memories. Harold led us to the loft. The wooden stairs were rotted through in places, but we climbed carefully. The beam above smelled faintly of hay and something else. Something faintly sweet like decayed fruit. Then we saw it. A faded, tattered piece of fabric caught on one of the wooden slats. It was a child's shirt, frayed at the edges and stained, dark with something that wasn't just dust. Harold's face turned pale. "That's Samuel's." Mark and I stood there in silence, the weight of it settling over us like a fog. "He's still here." Harold whispered, his voice hollow. He's not just a ghost. He's hungry. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. What do we... You mean hungry? I choked out. Harold shook his head. Not for food, for attention, for something he's lost. He's been trapped here, waiting, watching, and now he's marked her. I felt my knees go weak. What do we do? Mark's voice was barely a whisper. Harold looked at us with hollow, haunted eyes. You need to leave. Get out before it's too late. But as we turned to go, we heard it, a faint giggle, echoing through the barn. We froze, and then we saw her. Small figure standing in the shadows, her face pale, eyes hollow, and a faint, twisted smile on her lips. Samuel. He wasn't just a ghost. He was something else, and he wasn't ready to let go. We didn't wait to see if the figure would move. We bolted down the barn stairs, hearts pounding like war drums. The old wooden floor creaked under our frantic footsteps, echoing the terror that had gripped us. Outside, the morning light felt false. Too bright, too sharp, like the sun itself was aware of the darkness we'd just uncovered. Mark yanked open the truck door, fumbling with the keys, his hands trembling. I didn't care about the keys. I just wanted to get Lily out of that house, away from whatever had been lurking there for decades. Where's Lily? I gasped. Mark's face drained of color as he realized. She's still inside. We didn't wait for a plan. We just ran. The front door to the farmhouse stood open, its hinges creaking mournfully. The house seemed to sigh as we entered, the stale air thick with the faint metallic tang of rust and old wood. The hallway stretched before us like a dark tunnel, the walls whispering secrets we didn't want to hear. We found Lily in her crib, still asleep. But something was wrong. Her eyes were open. Not just open, wide, unblinking, staring at the ceiling with an expression that wasn't hers. Her little fingers were curled into claws, her skin cold to the touch, and her breath was shallow, uneven. I felt a wave of pure, primal fear wash over me. Mark reached for her, but I grabbed his arm. Wait. Something's wrong. The air grew, colder, the temperature dropping like we'd stepped into the shadow of something ancient and forgotten. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but it echoed through the walls like it was speaking directly into my mind. She's mine now. I turned to see the dark figure from the barn standing in the hallway. But this time it wasn't, just standing. It was crawling. Its limbs moved at unnatural angles, bones cracking with every jerky motion. Its face was a hollow mask of a child, mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, teeth sharp and black. Its eyes were empty, but I felt them, watching, reaching, pulling. Mark shouted something, but I couldn't hear him. The world had gone silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I reached out to Lily, but the moment my fingers brushed her cheek, she screamed. Not a cry. A scream that split the air, raw and primal. Her eyes snapped into focus, and for a second I saw her, truly saw her. Not the thing that had been hiding behind her gaze. Then it was gone. The thing, Samuel, was gone. The house went still. Mark and I stared at each other, fear etched into our faces. We didn't wait for explanations. We grabbed Lily, her tiny body burning hot, her eyes wide with terror, and we left. We didn't look back. After that, we've been living in a small apartment ever since. Lily's healthy now, normal, or as normal as a child can be, after being marked by something you can't explain. She doesn't talk about the house, about the thing that followed us home, or the whispers in the dark. But I know it's still there. Sometimes when the wind is just right, I hear faint whispers through the walls. When Lily sleeps, I hear her, giggling softly in the dark. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find her staring at nothing, her eyes wide, her fingers reaching out to something I can't see. I know it's watching, I know it's waiting, and I know it's still hungry. When I first arrived at Holloway University, I wasn't expecting much beyond the usual dorm life. Late-night study sessions, occasional parties, and the occasional weird roommate. The campus was picturesque, with ivy-clad buildings and old, Gothic towers that looked like they belonged in a horror movie, but nothing about it screamed haunted, not until I moved into dorm 3B. My roommate, Elise, was a history major with an obsession for obscure facts. She'd spent hours telling me about the rumors surrounding Holloway Hall, especially the dorm where we'd been assigned. They say the building was built over a plague pit, she'd say, rolling her eyes as if it was just another urban legend. Some say you can still hear the whispers if you listen close enough. We laughed it off, of course, but laughter has a way of fading when the lights go out, and the silence stretches too long. It was a night like any other, until it wasn't. Was curled up on my bed scrolling through my phone when Elise's voice cut through the quiet. Did you hear that? I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was dark except for the faint glow of my phone. She was staring at the door, eyes wide, breath shallow. I strained to listen. There it was, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the small room, sharp and deliberate like the ticking of an ominous clock. My pulse quickened. Elise swallowed hard. That's not normal. I nodded, but my throat felt dry. The knocks came again, this time from inside the dresser. Knock, knock, knock. We both froze. Okay, this is just a joke, right? I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as her, but there was no response, just the steady rhythm of the knocks. I remembered my great-aunt's words, her voice like gravel in my mind. Never answer when the dead knock. The third one isn't a request. It's permission. I laughed nervously, trying to dismiss the chill crawling up my spine. It's probably just a draft. But drafts don't knock. We sat there for what felt like hours, the room growing colder with each passing minute. Then, finally, the knocks stopped. Silence. Elise's eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw the fear reflected in her gaze. I'm not going crazy, she whispered. You heard it too. The next morning, Elise was quiet, her usual sharp wit replaced by an eerie stillness. Over coffee in the common room, she finally confessed. I've seen her, she whispered, her fingers trembling around the mug. The woman in the mirror. She's been there for weeks, always watching. I wasn't sure what to say. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell her it was just stress. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. We both knew something was wrong. The days following that first night felt like walking through fog. Holloway Hall's once familiar creaks and groans now felt like whispers, each sound a note in an eerie symphony. The laughter I'd expected from college life was replaced with tense glances, hurried footsteps, and the distant echoes of something, or someone, just out of sight. Elise didn't sleep. I barely did. Every night the knocks returned, but they were no longer just knocks. They had evolved, soft scratching, like fingernails against old wood, sometimes faint whispers slipping through the gaps in the walls. I kept telling myself it was just old plumbing, faulty wiring, anything but that. But deep down, I knew better. It was on the third night after the scratching began that I finally saw her. I had been lying in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow of my phone casting faint shadows across the room. Elise was asleep, or at least I thought she was. I glanced over to find her sitting up, staring at the mirror above her dresser with an expression I can't even describe. Her face was pale, eyes wide, and her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to scream but couldn't. I followed her gaze. That's when I saw her. A figure, gaunt, shadowy, and draped in a tattered wedding gown, stood behind us in the reflection. She wasn't moving, not in the way people do when they're alive. Her presence felt wrong, like her reflection was trying to reach through the glass. I froze. Then Elise whispered, "She's here." I scrambled out of bed, heart racing. I spun around to face the room, but there was nothing. No one, just the dull glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. But when I looked back at the mirror, she was still there. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. Elise finally broke the silence. "I've been seeing her for weeks," she said, her voice trembling. "She's always there, just waiting." I wanted to tell her it was just stress, maybe she was imagining things. But the terror in her eyes told me this wasn't a trick of the mind. The next day, we tried to ignore it. We convinced ourselves it was just the stress of exams, the pressure of college life. But that night the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door. Elise's face was pale, her eyes filled with silent pleas. We didn't open it, but the knocking didn't stop. Instead, it moved. The sound shifted from the door to the walls, to the floorboards, to the ceiling. It was like the very building was trying to get in. Then I heard something else, a faint whisper, just loud enough to be heard over the tapping. "Come back." I froze. Elise turned to me, her face filled with terror. "She's calling us." That's when I realized it wasn't just about the mirror. She was here, and she was getting closer. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. Holloway Hall felt different, like the walls themselves were pressing inward, breathing, with a life that wasn't mine. The flickering lights, the creaking floors, the cold drafts, none of it was just old architecture anymore. Elise left after that third night. She packed her things in silence, her eyes hollow, the weight of everything we'd been through etched into her face. She didn't look back when she walked out the door, and I didn't blame her, but I couldn't leave. I don't know why. Maybe it was the part of me that wanted answers, or maybe it was something else. Something that had already taken root inside me. The knocking didn't stop after Elise left. It was worse. Now it was a constant rhythm, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. The whispers grew louder, layered with words I couldn't quite understand. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my studies, but the shadows in the corners of my room grew darker, more defined. Then came the dreams. In my sleep, I was back in the dorm, but the walls were bleeding black ink dripping onto the floor, pooling into shapes I couldn't quite recognize. There was a figure in the dark, a woman in a wedding gown, her face twisted into something hollow and empty. She'd reach for me, her fingers long and brittle, but I'd always wake up before she touched me, until the night she did. I woke up with her hand pressed against my cheek, cold as ice, her touch sending chills through my entire body. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just stared into her empty eyes, and she whispered, "You're mine now." When I finally managed to sit up, she was gone. But the room was different. The mirror was cracked down the middle, jagged lines spiderwebbing across the glass. I knew. Then I wasn't just seeing her, she was inside me. The next day I found an old journal tucked beneath the loose floorboard by my bed. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear. It belonged to someone named Clara, a student who lived in this dorm nearly a century ago. The entries spoke of the same things I'd been experiencing, the tapping, the whispers, the shadow in the mirror, and then I read something chilling. She doesn't like to be ignored. She'll come for you if you don't invite her in. I thought about it. I thought about the nights I'd spent trying to fight it, trying to pretend it wasn't real. But what if that's exactly what she wanted? What if ignoring her was what made her stronger? That night, I sat in front of the mirror with the journal in my lap, the room dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside. I whispered, "Come in." The response was immediate. The room grew colder, the air thick with something metallic. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and I saw her face, closer than ever. She smiled, not a kind smile, a smile filled with hunger. Her hand reached out of the mirror, fingers curling toward me, and I felt myself being pulled forward. My heart raced as I struggled, but it was no use. I was drawn in, my reflection merging with hers, becoming one. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't in my dorm room anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere darker. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of something rotten. My body felt wrong, like I was stitched together from pieces that didn't belong to me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. Not because I was paralyzed, but because I wasn't sure which part of me was me anymore. I looked around. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, each one reflecting not just my face but her, the woman in the wedding gown. She stood in the reflections, her hollow eyes fixed on me, her mouth stretched into that same hungry smile. But there was something different about her now. She wasn't just in the mirrors, she was in me. I could feel her, like an echo in the back of my mind. A whisper that wasn't mine, urging me to do things I wouldn't normally do. She's yours now. The words weren't spoken aloud. They were felt, like vibrations in the bone. I struggled to remember who I was before this, before Holloway Hall, before the tapping, the whispers, the dreams. But the memory felt distant, slipping through my fingers like water. Then I saw it, my reflection in one of the cracked mirrors. But it wasn't me. It was her. She smiled wider, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass. "You invited me in," she whispered, her voice a chorus of echoes. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The mirrors began to shift, warping and distorting, pulling me closer with each heartbeat. I felt myself being drawn toward them, my reflection stretching, merging with her. And then I realized I wasn't the one trapped. She was, but she didn't need to be. She had me now. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't the first. The journal, Clara's journal, wasn't the only one. There were others. Others who'd whispered, "Come in." Others who'd been pulled into the mirrors, their reflections lost, their souls claimed. I wasn't just a victim. I was a part of the story now. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own reflection, smiling back at me with hollow eyes. But it wasn't me. It was her. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my dorm room, but nothing was the same. The walls were darker, shadowed by something unnatural. The flickering fluorescent light overhead buzzed with an uneven hum, casting long, restless shadows across the room. My desk was covered in cracks, like glass splintering just beneath the surface. And she was there, in the mirror. Her reflection was no longer confined to the glass. She stood right behind me, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. Her face was gaunt, her wedding gown tattered, stained with something that looked like dried blood. Or maybe just shadow. I should have screamed. I should have run. But I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, my body betraying me. Then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Not from the door, from beneath the bed. I knew what it was. It was the same sound that had haunted me since the first night, like a coffin lid closing, a whisper disguised as a threat. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Elise. "You're not alone." I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was just a joke, but the words felt heavy, like they carried weight I didn't understand. The knocking grew louder. I finally managed to move, scrambling, off the bed, but the room shifted as soon as I stood. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in time with something ancient and hungry. I grabbed the journal I'd found, the one that had belonged to Clara. The pages were stained with ink that had faded over time, but the words were clear. Never answer when the dead knock. The third one isn't a request, it's permission. I had already given that permission. I could feel her presence now, stronger than ever, like a shadow that had woven itself into the very fabric of my being. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't fight her, not with strength, not with words. But maybe I could choose to leave. I reached for the mirror, my reflection warping as if it was trying to escape. My hand met the cold glass, and for a second, I felt her. Icy fingers wrapping around mine, pulling me closer. I whispered, "I'm not yours." The reflection screamed in a voice that wasn't mine, a sound that tore through the room like glass shattering. I yanked my hand back, the mirror cracking into a spiderweb of fractures. The knocking stopped. The room went silent. But the silence was deafening. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, then I heard it, her whisper right next to my ear. "You can't leave now." The darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up, I was still in my dorm room, but I wasn't alone. She was there, and I wasn't me anymore. The mirror in my room is cracked now. I don't know if it's mine or hers. I don't think I'll ever be able to tell the difference. I never intended to rent the house on Bleecker Street. I was only looking for a place that wasn't too far from work, something affordable, and maybe a little less bleak than the studio apartments I'd been considering. It didn't have to be perfect, just functional. But when I walked through the front door of that Victorian, something inside me shifted. The house was strange. It had a sort of oppressive silence that wrapped itself around you, clinging to your skin. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the old wooden frames, sent shivers crawling down my spine. The air smelled like mildew and something burning, something metallic, almost like rust and burnt hair. That's how I would describe it even now. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself it was the old pipes, the dust, the age of the place. I wasn't afraid of things like that. But the house? It had a presence. One that gnawed at the edges of my mind when I was alone. The first time I noticed the silhouette in the parlor was the first night I stayed there. It wasn't much, just a vague figure, dark and looming, barely perceptible against the dim light from the street lamp outside. I blamed it on the bad lighting, the shadows. It could have been the shape of a chair or a coat hanging on the back of the door. It could have been anything. But the next night when I sat on the worn couch, the silhouette was back. And this time its outline wasn't quite right. It was too tall, too thin, too wrong. I figured it was my eyes playing tricks on me. I hadn't slept well the past few days, and I was already on edge from the move, the new job, the change. Maybe I was just tired, or stressed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house creaked and groaned under the weight of its age, pipes rattling in the walls, floors sighing beneath my feet. And yet there was a coldness to the air that didn't feel right, even for a house built in the 1800s. The walls seemed to hum with something that was just out of reach, like they were alive, like they were breathing. By the third night, I found myself lying in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take me. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of something shuffling across the floor. I held my breath, hoping it was just my mind overactive, but the sound grew louder, closer. A faint scraping noise like something dragging across wood. I sat up, in bed, heart pounding in my chest. I glanced around the room, but there was nothing, just the dim glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe the house was settling. I tried to get back to sleep, but the noise kept coming, the shuffling, the scraping. Then, just as I thought I was losing my mind, there was a flash of light from the parlor, a figure standing in the corner. I froze. My heart raced. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, tall and thin, its features barely discernible in the dark. Had to see what it was. My legs felt like stone, but somehow I forced myself to move. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My breath caught in my throat as I peered around the corner into the parlor. Nothing. I stepped forward, eyes darting around the room. The furniture was the same as before, an old couch, a faded rug, a dust-covered lamp. And yet something was different. Something was watching me. I could feel it. I didn't dare look directly at the corner again, but I knew it was there, just beyond the threshold of my vision. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every whisper of wind against the windows made my heart jump in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for me in that house. Something that had been there long before I arrived. The next morning, I called the landlord to ask if there was any history with the house. He was hesitant at first, but after a long pause, he told me that the previous tenants had left abruptly. No explanation, no forwarding address, just gone. He was vague about the details, as though he didn't want to say too much. And when I asked about the parlor, about the figure I'd seen, he changed the subject quickly. I couldn't explain it, but I didn't need to. I already knew. The house on Bleecker Street was haunted. The days blurred together after I moved into the house on Bleecker Street. I wasn't sleeping well, just fragments of restless dreams stitched together with echoes of creaking floors and distant whispers. The house felt like it was breathing, shifting with every hour that passed. But amidst the lingering dread, something else emerged. A presence, not the kind that made your skin crawl, but one that wrapped around you like an old, familiar blanket. I first noticed it on a night when the anxiety hit hardest. I was sitting on the couch in the parlor, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the street lamp outside. The walls seemed too thin, the silence too loud. My chest tightened with that familiar squeeze, the kind that felt like 1,000 invisible hands pressing down, suffocating me. I wanted to escape, but there was nowhere to go, not in this house. That's when I felt it. A warmth, subtle and steady, settled into the old armchair by the window. It wasn't like the cold drafts that seeped through the cracks or the chill that crept under the door. No, this was different, comforting. I didn't look at it right away. I was too afraid to face whatever it might be. But as the minutes passed, the pressure in my chest began to ease. The tight knot that had coiled around my heart unraveled just slightly, enough for me to breathe again. Eventually, I turned my head. And there it was. A figure, sitting perfectly still in the armchair, its form vague but undeniably present. It wasn't terrifying. In fact, it looked almost peaceful, like it belonged there. It had no discernible face, just a dark silhouette against the dim light, its shape relaxed, almost human. The warmth came from it, radiating outward like it was trying to soothe me, to tell me that I wasn't alone. I called it Arthur. I didn't know why. Maybe because the name felt right, like an echo from a memory I couldn't quite place. Or maybe because it reminded me of my uncle, the one who used to tell me stories when I was a kid. His voice rough like gravel, but warm like a hearth fire. Arthur never moved, never spoke. But whenever I felt overwhelmed, I'd sit near the armchair, and it was like the air itself grew lighter. I started to believe Arthur was real, not just a figment of my imagination, but something more, something that had been there before me, maybe even before the house itself. But things changed. It wasn't just the whispers in the dark anymore. Now there were voices, not loud, not demanding, but faint murmurs that seemed to echo from the walls. Sometimes I'd hear them while I was making coffee, other times while I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling. They'd say my name, soft and distant, like forgotten songs drifting through the cracks, and Arthur was always there. Always. Then, one night, the silence shattered. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up, straining to hear over the rush of blood in my ears. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the streetlight seeped through the blinds, casting long, jagged shadows. Arthur's chair was empty. I felt a chill wash over me, the kind that sank deep into your bones. I told myself it was just the wind. Maybe I'd accidentally knocked the chair over. But as I got up to check, I noticed something strange. Muddy footprints leading from the armchair to the hallway. I followed them. They led to the basement door. The basement had always been a source of unease for me. The door creaked ominously whenever I opened it, and the air down there was thick with the smell of rust and something faintly metallic, like blood that had dried long ago. I never liked going down there, but now the footprints called to me, pulling me down into the darkness. The basement light flickered as I descended the stairs, casting eerie shadows that danced along the peeling walls. The footprints stopped, at the far wall where an old wooden chest sat, its surface scratched and stained with something dark, something that wasn't just dirt. I opened the chest. Inside was nothing but old, faded newspapers, the edges curled and brittle. But beneath them I found something else. A small rusted claw hammer. The handle was worn smooth from use and the metal head was streaked with dark, dried stains. I stared at it, heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it. A faint, wet, clicking whisper. You gave it power when you gave it a name. I spun around, but the basement was empty. I grabbed the hammer, my fingers trembling as I clenched it. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind, twisting around my thoughts like vines. Tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the stress was getting to me. But deep down I knew better. I'd named it. And now, it was real. The hammer was heavy in my hand, its rust-streaked surface cold against my palm. I stood there in the dim basement light, staring at it like it was going to grow fangs and bite me. The whisper was gone, but the echo remained in the corners of my mind, like an aftertaste that wouldn't fade. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The hammer sat on my nightstand, its presence an uninvited guest in the room I'd once called safe. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt deafening, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I needed answers. The next day, I went out and bought a voice recorder from a corner electronics store, one of those cheap handheld models with buttons that clicked too loudly. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I figured if there was something in the house, something real, I'd capture it. That night, I set the recorder on my nightstand and pressed record. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the nothingness. Hours passed. Then came the click. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. A faint, wet, clicking sound, like something dripping, slow and deliberate. I sat up, heart racing, and stared at the recorder. Still, it only captured static. But then there it was, a whisper. You gave it power when you gave it a name. I froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I recognized, not human in any familiar way. It was wet, almost like it was speaking underwater, the words slithering through the static, like something alive. I hit stop and rewound the tape, my fingers trembling. I played it again. The same message, clear as day. I didn't know what to think. I wanted to dismiss it, tell myself it was just a trick of the mind, that maybe the recorder was picking up some interference. But deep down, I knew better. This was real. The next day I reviewed the recording again, listening to the faint background noises. There was something strange, barely audible but there, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. But it wasn't coming from the tape recorder. It was coming from the walls. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that scratching, soft and rhythmic, like someone, or something, was trying to get out. The sound was louder in the basement, so I grabbed the recorder and went down there, the hammer tucked into the waistband of my jeans. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air thick and heavy. I turned on the recorder and pressed record again, holding it out like a lifeline. At first, all I heard was the faint hum of the old pipes, the occasional drip of water from the leaky ceiling. Then came the noise, scratching, sharp and frantic like claws against wood. But this time there was something else. A voice, soft, distorted, but unmistakable. Help me. I dropped the recorder. The hammer clattered to the floor with a metallic clang. I rushed to pick it up, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from the darkness, from somewhere just beyond the light's reach. I scanned the basement, but there was nothing there, just shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. Then the scratching stopped. I waited, breath caught in my throat, and then a soft, wet click. I turned around. The basement door was open. I hadn't opened it. I crept toward it, the hammer clenched tightly in my hand. The door creaked as I pushed it slightly, revealing the darkness beyond. The air grew colder and the smell hit me, something metallic and sharp, like rust and old blood. I looked down and saw more muddy footprints leading into the darkness. But this time they weren't just footprints. They were handprints, smudged in the dirt as if someone had dragged themselves across the floor. I followed them, the recorder still running, capturing every sound, every whisper, every breath of the house. The trail led to an old wooden chest tucked into the corner of the basement. I'd seen it before but never paid it much attention. Now, it felt like it was waiting for me. I opened it. Inside was nothing but old, yellowed newspapers and scraps of fabric. But beneath them I found something else, a small rusted key, and written on the inside of the chest in faded, jagged handwriting were the words, "You're not alone." I didn't know what to make of it, but as I stood there staring at the key, I heard it again. A voice this time louder. You gave it power when you gave it a name. And then the recorder stopped. I looked down, realizing with a jolt that the recorder had stopped recording on its own. The tape was gone. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. Spun around, hammer raised, but no one was there. Just the darkness, and the faint, wet click of something moving in the shadows. The key was heavy in my pocket as I ascended the basement stairs, its cold brass pressing against the fabric of my jeans, like a warning. The house was still except for the faint, rhythmic creaking of the floorboards, like the house itself was breathing, exhaling after a long, tense inhale. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Something was different. Placed the key on the kitchen counter, the metal clinking softly against the worn laminate. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd found. The voice on the tape, the muddy handprints, the key. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. I spent the next day searching the house, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, every creak in the floorboards. The house felt wrong, like the walls themselves were watching, waiting. The comforting presence of Arthur, the shadow that had once sat quietly in my armchair, was gone. The empty chair stared back at me, its presence now more oppressive than comforting. I decided to take the key and see if it fit anywhere. The chest in the basement was the obvious choice, but I'd already opened it. It held nothing but old newspapers, scraps of fabric, and that strange message. So I focused on the door. The basement door. It was slightly ajar, just like it had been that night when I'd first heard the whisper. I knelt down, key in hand, and fitted into the rusted lock. It clicked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that led into the earth. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp soil and something metallic, something like old blood. I hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, I stepped inside. The passage was barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, the walls pressing in on either side. I felt like I was walking through the ribs of some ancient beast. The air grew thicker with each step, heavy with the weight of something unseen. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails scratching against wood, or something worse. Followed the sound, the flickering light from my phone casting long, jagged shadows against the rough stone walls. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other end was desperate to be found. I reached the end of the passage and found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in dark stains, some of it dried and crusty, others fresh, still seeping like wounds. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, old and splintered, its legs stained with something dark and sticky, and sitting in the chair was a figure, the man in the raincoat. His yellow slicker was torn and stained with mud, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hood. But I could see his jaw, unhinged like a snake's, his mouth stretching wide, filled with jagged yellow teeth. I froze. He didn't move, but his head tilted slightly, as if he knew I was there. I wanted to run, to turn around and never look back, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The man's mouth opened and a voice crawled out wet and ragged. "Why did you name it?" I swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. I stammered, my voice trembling. I didn't know. I didn't know what it was. The man in the raincoat slowly raised his hand, pointing a long, bony finger at me. "You gave it power when you gave it a name." Suddenly the walls seemed to pulse as if the house itself was alive, breathing in time with the man's words. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then, as if on cue, the room went dark. The lights flickered, the shadows stretching like hungry fingers, and I felt something cold and clammy wrap around my ankle. I looked down. There was nothing there, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned back to the man in the raincoat. He was gone. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, the hammer falling from my waistband and clattering to the floor. My phone's light flickered one last time before going dark. I was plunged into darkness. And then I heard it. A faint, wet, clicking sound. It was coming from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. I wasn't alone. I fumbled for the hammer, my fingers brushing against something cold and slick. When I looked down, my hand was covered in dark, sticky fluid. I didn't want to know what it was, but I knew. I could feel it in my bones. And then the voice came again. This time, not a whisper, but a scream. "You gave it power when you gave it a name." I dropped the hammer, I turned and ran. I don't remember how I got out of the basement. One moment I was running, my heart thudding in my chest like a drumbeat of panic. The next I was standing on the front porch, the door slammed shut behind me, my hands trembling and my breath ragged. The hammer was gone. I stared at the door, waiting for it to creak open, for the man in the raincoat to step out, his jaw unhinged, his fingers reaching for me. But nothing happened. The house was silent, too silent. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? "Hello, I think I've been haunted by a supernatural entity that whispered to me in the dark and left me with blood on my hands." They'd hang up on me faster than I could say paranormal, so I didn't call. Instead, I grabbed the hammer from where it had fallen, its handle slick with something dark and sticky. My hands felt numb, as if the fear had drained the warmth from my body. I went inside. The house was colder than before. Arthur's chair was still empty. But something had changed. The walls felt closer, the shadows deeper. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive. I moved through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The tape recorder was still on the kitchen counter, its screen dim. The words, "You gave it power when you gave it a name," burned into my memory. I picked it up. The tape was still there. I pressed play. Silence. Then a soft, wet clicking sound. "You gave it power when you gave it a name." The voice wasn't just on the tape. It was in the walls. It was in me. I dropped the recorder, my fingers now trembling uncontrollably. The house groaned, the lights flickered, and then the basement door creaked open. I didn't want to go down there, but I had to. I had to know. I descended the stairs, the hammer clenched tightly in my fist. The basement was darker than before, the air thick with the smell of rust and something else, something metallic and sweet. I could hear whispers now, not just from the tape, but from everywhere. "You gave it power when you gave it a name." I reached the bottom of the stairs. The room was different. The chair was gone, but there was something else. A circle drawn in dark, smudged chalk on the floor. Symbols I didn't recognize, twisted and jagged, like they'd been scribbled by a child with a broken crayon, and in the center of the circle, the man in the raincoat. His face was no longer hidden beneath the brim of his hood. His jaw was stretched impossibly wide, filled with teeth that seemed too sharp, too many. He was smiling. "You called it in?" he whispered, his voice like gravel, being scraped across glass. "You gave it power when you gave it a name." I raised the hammer, my knuckles white, but it was too late. The shadows reached for me. I swung the hammer blindly, connecting with something solid, something that screamed in a voice that wasn't human. When I looked down, the hammer was covered, in blood, thick, dark, and pulsing like it was alive. But the man was gone, so was the circle. The basement was empty, except for the tape recorder still playing. I picked it up with trembling hands. You gave it power when you gave it a name. And then the recording stopped. The silence was deafening. I looked around, my heart racing. Nothing was left. Nothing but me. I left the house that night, the hammer still in my hand, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. The next day I found the tape recorder in my bag. I'd never put it there. I pressed play. Silence. Then, a whisper. You gave it power when you gave it a name. I threw the recorder into the trash. But I still hear it. In the quiet. In the dark. I still hear, you gave it power when you gave it a name.